Chapter 51. Her Majesty the Queen. Through the narrow and high window on veranda, the setting sun shone its scarlet light on the floor and imprinted vermilion strips on the wall. In the whole kingdom, there were only a few places left where one could still see sunsets, and Port of Clearwater was one of them. It was rumored that the months of demons in which heavy snows and storms prevailed had almost no influence on this place. Apart from the fact that Black Sail Fleet couldn't sail forth from the harbor, the whole city was as busy as usual. The lord of this harbor city, Garcia Wimbledon, was sitting at the table below the window and reading the letter in her hand attentively. Her gray hair had a tinge of gold in the setting sun, and the play of shadow and light on her face made her features even sharper, lending it even more charm and audacity. Ryan had stood beside her for quite a while. Though the letter had occupied the Queen longer than usual, Ryan chose to wait quietly aside, for he doesn't want to be the one who disturbs the peace in this room. At last, Garcia let out a sigh and put down the letter. "My father died." Ryan was dazed for a moment until he said, "What?" "My father, Ailing Wimbledon, the king of the Kingdom of Greycastle, has died." She seldom repeated what she had said, he thought to himself. She would have ignored his question if she had reacted according to her usual manner. But couldn't she be joking? Could the king really be dead? Ryan opened his mouth in attempt to comfort her, but his words turned to a question: how did he die? Fortunately, Garcia took no notice of all this psychological activity. She was Princess Garcia, Lord of the Port of Clearwater, the Supreme Commander of Black Sail Fleet, and cared for no one's comforting. The letter said, "It was my brother Gerald who killed the father and was later caught by the guards. He didn't commit suicide to escape punishment, so the hand of the king and a few other ministers made him go through a public trial and sentenced him to decapitation." "This couldn't be the case," replied Ryan subconsciously. "Of course this couldn't be the case," said Garcia impassively. "My brother was stupid, but not stupid enough to court his own death. Without someone else's instigation, he couldn't have done this. Did someone set him up? Let me guess." Princess Garcia closed her eyes in contemplation. "Maybe someone made a detailed proposal to him, saying that they could help him to take the throne. To bring assassins into the king's city is impossible unless careful arrangements are made, including killing, swapping, and buying off personnel. But that has never been what Gerald is good at, or rather, he doesn't care to deal with these trifles. So it's not hard to conclude that the ones who made the arrangements had all his trust, yet betrayed him at the last moment." Ryan didn't reply, for all was just speculation. How things happened no longer mattered. It was the result that mattered the most. He believed that Princess Garcia was of the same opinion. As expected, Garcia opened her eyes and continued, "There were so many stupid men around my big brother, every one of them a muscular beast. No wonder they were all duped." It was only her voice was then tinged with anger. Timothy's ways were far too cruel. "Are you saying that it was Timothy Wimbledon who did this? Who knows Gerald better than he does? Who will benefit the most from this state of affairs?" Garcia said, knocking her fingers unconsciously on the table. "A blind man can see that. But he didn't have to do this, for he had been father's favorite." Ryan realized that Her Highness was upset. It was unusual for her to put on such an expression. Much as she complained about King Wimbledon III's excessive partiality, she would have never wanted her father to have such an end. Ryan could understand her feelings more or less. It was exactly how the younger generation felt towards the elder in a big family. The elders are like a mountain to cross, arousing respect, awe and loathing. If she had been right and Prince Timothy had done all this, then the prince could be called cruel. But why did he have to do this? Because he was afraid of me. Garcia took a deep breath and seemed to be gathering herself together, saying he was afraid of the Black Sail Fleet. Seeing that Ryan didn't reply, she continued to explain, Timothy have informers in the port of Clearwater. There's nothing strange about that, just like I have a range informers in Valencia and King's City. When he knew about the existence of Black Sail Fleet, he could easily guess what was my next plan. However, Valencia doesn't have an army that can resist Black Sail Fleet. So he used the most stupid way, making Gerald his stepping stone to get what he wants. Do you mean that he wants an army? He wants the crown, said Garcia. When Gerald dies, he will be the first in line of succession. Now that my father had died, he must have been on the way to King's City. As long as Timothy becomes Wimbledon IV, he can muster the forces of feudatory and army beyond the limit of domains, she continued, shaking her head. But as I have said, he didn't have to do this as father's favorite son. Isn't this the worst situation? Ryan said worriedly, what if Prince Timothy is successfully crowned, declares that royal decree on the selection of crown prince has come to an end, and then summons you to King's City? Garcia replied scornfully, this step of his was much too blunt. My father's partiality doesn't entail the support from most ministers. The murder of the king is no trivial matter. Though Timothy has shifted the blame to Gerald, he could only fool the commoners. It would take him a long time before he could seize the power of Kingdom of Greycastle completely. So she turned to look at Ryan. I may have to change my plan a little. Ryan at once went down on one knee and said, I'm all at your service. Garcia stood up and walked to the window, her back to Ryan. He would take on me as soon as he were crowned. But what he could think of could only be ordering Joey Cole, Duke of the Southern Territory, to exert military pressure on me. Yet the latter would probably take the mourning of the latest king as an excuse to hold back his troops. The old man's too sly to take any risks. The most Joey Cole would do might be mustering his feudatories and making a show of it next to the border port of Clearwater. Princess Garcia made a little pause, but these possible movements might bring unnecessary troubles to us, so we shall sail forth tomorrow. Sail forth? Your Highness, would you want to? As it lies at the heart of the kingdom, Eagle City has been a city almost without defense. It is possible to arrive at town of Clear Spring by the tributary of San Juan River, and from there one can reach Eagle City within a day. After taking over Joe's city, the whole Southern Territory will be in my command. There will be such an interesting time lag. When he sits on the throne and wants to command Joey, he will find that the whole Southern Territory has been seized by M. I'd love to see his face then. But as you have said, King Wimbledon III has just passed away. In this way. What then? Shall I shed tears first? Garcia turned, while the setting sun on the sea surface cloaked her with magenta gossamer. Her face was hidden in the dark, yet there was still some flickering light in her eyes. Her eyes are so firm, Ryan thought, though there could be anger or pain in them, but there should be no place for sadness. Sadness is not for Her Highness. No, you shouldn't, he answered earnestly. Garcia nodded satisfactorily. Go and gather the captains here for me. Now that Timothy wouldn't wait until 5 years later, I'd certainly not disappoint him. The whole Southern Territory will be declared independent after I seize the Eagle City. It doesn't matter to her if it was done by Timothy, Ryan thought. She can always find her way in the most turbulent situation and head for her goal once a decision is made. This is where her charm lies and the reason why I've followed her. I'll do as you bid, Your Highness. No, Ryan answered respectfully, Your Majesty the Queen. Chapter 52 The Flame of the Heart Part 1. Roland knocked on the door and pushed it open after he heard Nightingale's consent. The heavy drapes hung in the room would only be pulled apart in the early morning and evening, to let in some fresh air. At other times they were down for warmth and shade. The only source of light came from the 2 candle stands at the end of the bed. The candles burned in silence and projected 2 crossing shadows on the objects in the room. He walked to the bed and watched the still unconscious girl buried in soft pillows and quilts. He let out a little sigh. "Everything is okay at the border front line?" Nightingale came to hand him a glass of warm water. "Everything has gone on well." Roland took a sip and handed the glass back to her. "After that day we didn't encounter any more large groups of demonic beasts. When the injured militia members returned to the army, they were inspired." "What about the opening in the city wall?" Carl moved the shell of that hybrid demonic beast to the damaged spot by rolling logs, and attached it to the city wall with hangers and winches. Roland knew that Nightingale was trying to divert his attention to keep him from worrying too much. But ever since he stepped into the room, all his attention could not help but be on the girl in slumber. The person who contributed the most to the last victory against the demonic beasts was Anna. If she had not blocked the damaged spot on the city wall with her flames, what would become of the battle was hardly imaginable. But she collapsed in his arms and had not woken up since. "It's been a week," Roland said softly. Theoretically speaking, if someone was in a coma and did not eat, drink or get nutrition through other means in more than a week, the body function would then deteriorate until the brain died gradually in the process. But Anna did not show any signs of serious illness or even weakness. Her look was at least much better than when she fainted off. Her cheeks were rosy. Her breath was smooth. The temperature one felt by touching her forehead was normal. All indicated that Anna was healthy, yet unable to wake up. "It's also the first time that I'm faced with such a situation." Nightingale, who stood aside, shook her head and said, "The magic in her has been empty during the battle. But now it's almost saturated and even thicker than before. If my estimation is right, she'll have her day of adulthood this middle night." "Do you mean that she'll come to adulthood in the coma?" "No, she might die in the coma." Nightingale spoke frankly. "One has to undergo the pain on the day of adulthood with the utmost willpower. As soon as one gives up resisting the pain, the magic power will bite a witch's body and destroy it irreversibly." Roland took a chair and sat beside the bed. "However, I remember you told me that when demonic torture happens, no matter how painful it is, one will retain clear consciousness until one either overcomes this crisis or dies." "Yes, indeed." In the Witch Cooperation Association, some witch had hoped to pass the demonic torture in a coma. It was not even day of adulthood pains, but less severe pains that happened once a year. Nightingale hesitated for a moment, and then said, "She sank into unconsciousness with the aid of alchemical potion, but that attempt was meaningless. The magic power bit her body and made her awake yet defenseless." "Does the pain increase gradually?" "No. When the time comes, the pain strikes like a thunder. But as for how long the pain lasts, it varies from one person to another. My sister was not weak." It was only her voice lowered. Roland understood what she meant. The uncertainty was a trial in itself, as one did not know how long one had persisted, and how much longer one would still have to persist. This felt like a lonely boat in the stormy sea, thereby making one lose hope even more quickly. In the silence, he felt a hand upon his shoulder. "I've seen too many deaths in my many years of vagrancy. The witches have been treated like animals, hanged, burned or tortured to death by the noble who take pleasure in their pains. The fortunate witches that survived could only distance themselves from the crowd and live in isolation, while Holy Mountain, a place that is nowhere to be found, serves as a feeble hope for them. Nightingale's voice became softer than usual. But Anna is different. It's the first time that I've seen someone outside the Witch Cooperation Association who cares so much for the witches. She's needed, respected and treated like a normal person, Your Highness. Even if Anna doesn't come to adulthood successfully, she has found her own holy mountain. But this would not be the ending that he wanted. Roland closed his eyes and recalled the first time he met her. Her feet were bare and her clothes were ragged, but yet she did not show any fear in a prisoner's cage. Her eyes were like unsullied lakes, serene and clear. She was the flame, yet not so flippant like the flames. Pictures flashed quickly in his mind. Now that I've satisfied your curiosity, sir, could you kill me now? I've never used my power to hurt anyone. I only hope to stay by your side, Your Highness. That's all. The demonic torture won't kill me. I'll beat it. What are you thinking of? I'm not going anywhere. Roland suppressed his emotions and said softly, I'll be at her side until the last moment. Me, too, and thank you. After dinner, Nana came as well. When she heard that Anna would come to adulthood, she insisted on staying. Roland had to arrange a room on the second floor for Tigui Pine, who had accompanied her. So just like that, Roland and the other two witches sat by the bed and waited quietly for midnight to arrive. Nightingale and Nana had to undergo the demonic torture in this winter as well. Fortunately, the awakening time was different for every witch. Otherwise, Roland thought he could not have acted so calmly if the three witches had to undergo their trials of life and death all at the same time. There was no belfry in the little town. The passing of time became unnoticeable in the dimly lit room. From time to time there was a shrieking sound of the wind current that passed through the window gap. Just when Roland began to feel drowsy, Nightingale observed. It started. Only she could see the magic in Anna that then became active. The green flame became thicker and thicker, and its center turned from bright to dark. The restless magic gradually converged to the center, as if dragged by something. It struggled and seethed, but yet its effort was in vain. Roland did not see this change, but he still felt that something was different. The flames of the candles flickered, though there was no wind in the room at the time. The flames became darker and darker, as if devoured by the shadows around. Then the color of the flame changed from red to green. He turned his gaze to the girl in bed. Anna was still in slumber without the slightest change of expression on her face, as if nothing in the room that happened was relevant to her. Then the candlelight became almost invisible. The flame was not out, but the green part of the flame was nibbling away at the red part until all light vanished and darkness prevailed. But soon light returned to the room, while the flames of the candles remained pure green. In the green light, the three looked at one another in confusion. Then Anna's groan pulled their attention back to her. She slowly opened her eyes. Anna, Roland was in a daze and thought. The girl blinked and smiled, and then reached out her right palm to the prince. Green flame leaped from her palm and burned quietly. Roland understood her intuitively. He placed his finger into the flame after a second's hesitation, but the expected burning pain did not come. Instead, what he felt was only gentleness and warmth, as if he had placed his finger in lukewarm water. Chapter 53, The Flame of the Heart Part 2. The next day after Anna woke up, Nightingale came to bid farewell to Roland. Though we don't know why, Anna is probably the first witch to have spent the day of awakening without pain, Nightingale said excitedly before leaving. Having lived with Roland for a long time, she got used to the word awakening to describe the transformation of witches. I'll bring my sisters and the Witch Cooperation Association to Border Town. I hope you'll accept them, just as you have accepted Anna. That was exactly what Roland prayed for. Anna's ability alone helped the town to improve the hot forging process so that the town could see the dawn of the industrial age, let alone the ability of a bunch of witches. Of course, considering Nightingale's safety, he asked her to stay, hoping that she could go to the impassable mountain range after the months of demons. But Nightingale was obviously too eager to wait. Many of my sisters will face the difficult period during the winter. If I could tell them the news earlier, maybe more of them can survive the awakening. Don't worry, few demonic beasts can sense my whereabouts. Then, when is your day of awakening? Roland finally asked. Nightingale mounted her horse and said, the end of the winter or early spring. She waved to Roland and rode off. Don't worry about me. That pain becomes lighter and lighter these years. Her reply made Roland lost in thoughts. He had been thinking about the reason why Anna got through the day of awakening successfully. After all, Anna said after awakening that she did not feel the slightest pain, which was a total reversal of Nightingale's notion. A witch gains her power from the demon, and thus she is tainted and evil. Such notions were rooted in people's mind, as they saw the witches would suffer terrible pain on the day of awakening. And when the witches died in the awakening, their blood and flesh would be dried and their skin would be burned, which became the irrefutable evidence of their depravity. However, Roland never believed in that notion. He had probed the memory of the real Prince Roland, but yet failed to find any evidence of the existence of God or demon. Since power was not endowed by God, then it should not be regarded as a standard to distinguish between good and evil. In fact, even if the gods existed and frequently interfered in the secular world, believers should be endowed with power after they chose their camp, and not the other way around. According to the description of Nightingale, the magic power gathered in the witch's body. Then was it possible that the vessel was damaged because the magic power could not be released? Roland thought it was quite possible, as the witches, faced with most people's hostility and oppression, had to hide their ability and pretend to be normal. Therefore, they had few opportunities to use their magic power before they reached their adulthood. Of course, Roland would not think that his castle happened to be a wonderland. He had already talked to Anna, knowing that she experienced insufferable pain before. If anything was different during this year, then it was the fact she used her ability almost every day since she came to the castle. And what Nightingale said before she left implicitly confirmed his assumption. Nightingale often used her ability of invisibility as it was hard to be noticed, and she had also been forced to train her ability. What's more, she could use her ability without any misgivings now. And that was why the bite on the day of awakening had little effect on her. After Roland returned to the castle, he immediately asked Nana to strengthen her training. If no one was hurt while defending the town, she would have to heal a variety of small animals. If the assumption was proved through Nana's training, it would have an earth-shattering effect on the witch community, as a curse of demon would change into the endowment of God. As long as he could ensure that his domain was safe and open to the witches, they would come here endlessly. Anyhow, everything got back on track after this incident. Roland urged the production of steam engine 2, which could also help Anna to familiarize herself with the new ability. Another shed was put up in the castle backyard, but to shelter snow this time. He felt that it would be safer to build his experimental base in his own territory. According to what Nightingale said, a witch's ability would be stable in her adulthood, and she might generate new derivative skill. Though he had not seen Anna's new skill yet, her way of controlling flame was completely different now. No, whether it could be called as a flame was uncertain now, Roland thought. If the former flame could be barely understood with common sense, the green flame now was utterly unexplainable. He named it as Heartfire because it could exist away from Anna, and change its shape at Anna's will, just as what she was doing now. A flicker of flame stood on the iron plate 2 meters away from her, swinging slightly back and forth, as if it was saluting. But Roland knew that it was controlled by Anna. Normally, it kept a temperature close to that of the body. Once Anna wanted to heat it up, it would instantly rise to a higher temperature and the color would change from green to dark green. Similarly, it could also change into a large cluster of flames. In addition, it could move at a slow speed. Unfortunately, it could not be far away from Anna. Through repeated testing, it was confirmed that the Heartfire would disappear if it was 5 meters or more away from Anna. Another feature of Heartfire was that Anna could summon a lot of flames, though she could barely control 2 flames simultaneously until now. Recently the border was quite calm. Demonic beasts still appeared outside the wall, but without demonic hybrids, it was hard for them to break through the defense line. As Roland said, the beasts became stronger and quicker, but they were just beasts. The demonic beasts were led to the middle section of the wall, so that the militia of about 100 soldiers could cope with the situation. So in addition to the daily routine inspection, Roland spent a lot of time on construction. He had set aside a site on the south of the castle, and planned to build houses on it for the arriving witches. As the investor of the project, he appointed Carl to be in charge to build a number of 2-story brick houses. A reasonable and pleasing layout, easy entrance and exit, convenient drainage system and other issues had to be taken into consideration, as he strove to create a well-planned neighborhood. He even considered distributing the witches to live in the old and new area of the town, so that they could live together with the common residents. Later he thought it over and deserted the plan. That might be helpful to speed up the common residents' understanding of the witches, but it might cause irreparable consequences before the misunderstanding was cleared up. After all, the different view of witches only existed within the militia right now. What's more, Roland could not guarantee that all of the witches brought by Nightingale would be pure and harmless. Most of them had suffered the pain and torture of the world, so Roland was afraid they were much more sophisticated. After all, witches like Anna and Nana were rare. Therefore, if the witches lived together, it was more convenient for centralized management. Relevant rules and regulations had to be drawn up before their arrival. Roland had no experience to refer to. After all, he was neither the personnel of Superpower Office of National Security Agency, nor was he the founder of the Avengers. How could he know how to manage a group of people with superpowers? He had to work out a temporary system by referring to the personnel management system used in companies, and planned to modify it slowly while putting it into practice. Of course, Roland knew that this plan was full of flaws. Anyhow, as a pioneer, who else could he rely on? If he chose to hide and be conservative in Border Town, maybe he could touch the threshold of industrialization in decades. But being a mortal man, how many decades could he afford? If he wanted to lead the town to the next era and be the pioneer of the reform, he had to have an adventurous spirit. Just when he was writing his thoughts on the parchment, Baroff opened the door and walked in. Shaking the snow off his coat and saluting to the prince, Baroff said, "Your Highness, a messenger of Longsong's stronghold has come." Chapter 54, The Bad News. Petrov never thought that he would return to Border Town so soon. He was unwilling to leave his warm house in such a cold winter, especially when the demonic beasts were raging on the continent. Nevertheless, Duke Ryan designated him to place the tricky document in the hands of Prince Roland. Certainly, he knew what was said in the document. In fact, the entire nobility of Greycastle was discussing the alarming news. The king died in a murder, and the murderer was Gerald Wimbledon, the king's eldest son. Subsequently, the king's second son rushed to the king's city and declared that he would succeed to the throne as the second in line, since the kingdom could not survive without a king. However, his action was not accepted by all. It was claimed that Gerald's trial was rather strange, as he was exposed only a few times during the whole interrogation, with his mouth sealed and his hands tightly bound. Therefore, some people were hoping to investigate the murder thoroughly and then decide who should inherit the throne. Besides, it was rumored that Timothy Wimbledon, the second prince, was the man who pulled the strings behind the murder. As the real murderer of the king, he pretended to be sad, but could not wait to ascend the throne. Regardless of the controversies, the second prince temporarily took over the position of the king, thanks to the full support of Prime Minister. At the same time, he issued recall orders to all his competitors. The battle for the throne had come to an end, and the princes and princesses, after receiving the orders, had to return to the king's city before the end of the winter. The new king would confer domain and titles on them, based on their ruling of territories over the past 6 months. Of course, Petrov could sense the eagerness behind the command. Through this, Timothy Wimbledon could know his siblings' reaction and know whether he could sit on the throne firmly. If they chose to give up the battle for the throne and return to the king's city, then Timothy Wimbledon would become the undisputed Wimbledon IV. All the documents to Border Town would be transferred through Longsong Stronghold first. When Duke Ryan read the recall order, he was fairly disdainful of it. The last king had controlled the lords well before he died. As for the second prince, his ascending to the throne was already controversial. Moreover, since Gerald was beheaded on the guillotine, it was highly doubtful that anyone would be willing to return to the king's city. Anyway, in the eyes of the 6 noble families in Longsong Stronghold, this command came at a good time. About 2 months ago, Earl of the Elk family made an unauthorized scheme, which made the Duke unhappy, especially when he knew the scheme failed. The prince also gave a fierce response, and he directly sentenced Kilsmed to be hanged. With this, both sides came to an open rupture. The Duke had originally planned to calm the troubled waters after the end of months of demons. But now with this document, he had a more legitimate option. After Roland Wimbledon returned to the king's city, Border Town would naturally be owned by the Duke again. And if the prince refused, the Duke could force him to leave, in the name of the new king. The Duke did not care much about who would inherit the throne in the end. But as a messenger, Petrov did not feel very comfortable. Last time he promised that he would bring back a new trade agreement, but the scheme of the Elk family came first. Now he visited Border Town again, but he brought bad news again. Whether it was the death of King Wimbledon III or the recall order of the new king, neither would be welcomed by Prince Roland, Petrov believed. The sail to Border Town was quite smooth. As Kingdom of Greycastle lay in the south of the continent, the river did not freeze even in winter. From time to time, Petrov looked outside the window. He did not see any people being starved to death or fleeing from the town, which indicated that Border Town did not fall to the demonic beasts. That surprised him slightly. After all, he witnessed how the city wall was built when he visited Border Town last time. Truth be told, He had little confidence in the stone wall plastered by mud. What he saw next surprised him more. A sailing ship with the banner of Willow Town slowly passed them on the right side of the river. He had seen such a scene before, but never in the months of demons. Border Town is doing business, even when they are fighting against the demonic beasts. How could they resist the brutal beasts without summoning all miners to the defense line? He thought. 3 days later, the ship arrived at the dock of Border Town. The wooden dock was still old and shabby, but beside it, a simple wooden shed was newly built. Once the ship was ashore, 2 guards walked out from the shed, staring at every move of the boatmen. Petrov immediately understood the meaning of setting sentries here. Prince Roland apparently did not want anyone to leave the town. Chapter 55, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Roland pushed open the door to his office, where Barov had been waiting for him for quite some time. He tossed the document to Assistant Minister Barov, settled back in his chair, and put his feet on his desk. If outsiders had not been present, he would have wanted to hum a tune. "Your Highness, please restrain your grief," said Barov. He read the letter, frowning and frowned. "The king has unfortunately passed away. The first prince is the murderer. It is a tragedy. I don't know what your highness intends to do next. Gerald's death was so peculiar. I want to see how Garcia and Tilly react before deciding," said Roland. "But in any case, we should be taking precautions." Barov looked at the prince, waiting for him to continue. "With this change in royal power, the king's city may become turbulent. The first thing to do is to vacate your beloved ones and family members. It was important to prevent the second prince from taking these people to threaten his personal ministers." Right now, Assistant Minister Barov was indispensable for maintaining the administrative and normal financial operation of Border Town. Roland sipped his tea and continued, "You, Carter, and your subordinates, need to write letters to your family members. I'll entrust the guards to go to the king's city with the letters and arrange shelter for them in other towns. No need to come to Border Town." Barov was not a fool. After 20 years of experience in politics, he immediately understood the prince's deliberate intention. No. Roland neither wished for the adversary to use the families to threaten his subordinates, nor did he want his subordinates to think he was trying to use the families to threaten them. So he chose a compromise, relocating them to other safer towns first. When things settled down, he could bring them to Border Town. "I understand. Thank you for your concern, Your Highness." Barov nodded his assent. Roland sighed with relief. He really had too few talented employees. And about the ore trade, the recent export of iron ore will be suspended. "We'll only sell raw gemstones to Willow Town," he commanded. "I need to keep the iron ore for my own use. This will reduce revenue, Your Highness. But it won't go down too much. The miners have found a new gemstone deposit that can make up some of the gap," Roland said. "And there would be no business during the winter. No one was willing to go out any time the demonic beasts might be hanging out. As a result, there would likely be only 2 or 3 transactions for the next 4 months. For the lightweight barge, obviously the transport of gemstones was a more cost-effective choice." "Understood." Barov jotted everything down. After Barov had left, Roland called on Carter Lannis. "I need to expand the size of the militia. After the recruitment release, please arrange to transfer a few members with quick response and high ability to the new platoons to become captains. The training must be based on the same method that was implemented last time. Your Highness, if you follow the old training method, It will probably be a long time before the new platoon is ready." "That's still stronger than a rabble," said Roland, waving him to do what he had said. The platoon trained thus far was far from being able to be called an army. He was afraid that they were at the level of college students after military training. But sometimes the measure of fighting capacity had to be compared to the opponent. In addition to the demonic beasts, they were also likely to encounter a group of private corps, mercenaries, and mixed platoons temporarily put together by serfs. As long as they were equipped with cross-era weapons, college students would be almost adequate. After Carter had left, Roland could not help laughing. He had not expected such a coincidence. It was a timely benefit, just like the passing of a pillow when sleep beckoned. Was it bad news for him? A dilemma? Wrong. He knew little about Garcia Wimbledon, but she was not the kind of person to be trampled upon at will. The first prince had been sentenced to death in such a short period of time. Even if there was no insider, she would probably not return to the king's city easily. He was just to follow suit. As long as he could guard border town without moving elsewhere, someone would certainly jump out, and the Duke of Longsong's stronghold was likely the first person to feel uneasy. Otherwise he would not have been so anxious about the documents and delivered them to him in such bad weather. For the Duke, the sooner he saw it, the sooner he would sleep and eat in peace. If Roland chose to stay in border town, it was equivalent to defying the new king's will. He would wait until the months of demons were over. The Duke would then probably want to give him a profound lesson under Timothy Wimbledon's banner. But this was exactly what Roland needed. If anyone were to ask what industrialization lacked the most, the answer would definitely be people. It required a large number of people to join in this large-scale production, turning the public into individual parts of a huge machine to drive it into operation. It was no exaggeration to say that with the sheep-eating men enclosure movement in Britain, a large number of farmers were deprived of their land, making them free laborers, which then laid a solid foundation for the later Industrial Revolution. The industrial age was so harsh. As long as educated workers were put into this furnace continuously, the exchange and return would be huge. The smaller the industrial classification, the larger the population needed to be. Roland had been troubled constantly by the problem of population. There were just over 2,000 inhabitants in border town. Even if it was a new era of machinery, it was still only workshop-style production. Without a large number of people, many projects could not be launched. Where could he swindle so many people to come to this town? Could he buy slaves? There was no mention of where to buy thousands of slaves at once. Adult slaves were expensive, and did not have much significant training. Younger slaves, under the age of 10, would take too long to train. Even if child labor was employed against conscience, the waiting period would still be too long. Could he recruit talents? How many people would be attracted to border town? This would result in more costs than buying slaves. Could he encourage people to give birth to more children? Forced marriages? Forget it. He had also considered Longsong's stronghold. But since the kingdom was in a stable state, if he were to attack the surrounding lords, it would simply be gambling with the future. Duke Ryan would also not dare to confront him blatantly. He would rather secretly try to put a spoke in his wheel. However, the situation was different now. Now that Timothy had ascended the throne, he was eager to see all his competitors disappear. This recall order reflected his eager mood. Duke Ryan had obviously been able to understand this. Once released from the old king's constraints, it would be strange for him, as the ruler in the western region, to do nothing. This was the opportunity Roland had been anticipating for a long time. Longsong Stronghold, as the border of the kingdom, was a century-old city with nearly 10,000 permanent residents. Behind Longsong Stronghold, there were towns with large tracts of land and no defensibility. If it was possible to defeat Duke of Longsong's stronghold and win the city, he would be able to get a large number of free people, while completing the original accumulation of wealth in the meantime. What easier way was there to gain population than annexation? What else could accumulate wealth faster than plunder? The news was like a lighthouse dispelling the mist, illuminating the direction of Roland's progress. He would never miss such a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Chapter 56, In the Mountains. Nightingale stepped slowly along the mountain trail. The path under her feet was only as wide as her shoulders. To one side was a huge stone cliff. Opposite were steep rocks. The two apart was about 3 meters wide. Below was a bottomless ravine. She carefully followed the stone cliff to avoid slipping. When she looked up, she saw that in the sky, there was only a thin ray of light, like a hanging silver thread. But she knew that it was noon. Even in the daytime, she had to carry a torch. The light coming through the rock was not bright enough to illuminate the road ahead. The long path gave the illusion that she was inside the mountains. The only advantage here was that despite the cold wind whistling and snow swirling in the mountains, the gap between the cliffs remained unaffected. Occasionally a few snowflakes fell from overhead down the cliffs and paths, quickly turning into water vapor. The temperature here was different from outside. Occasionally she could see warm gas rising from the abyss. Had it not been so, she would not have dared to go alone through the impassable mountain range in the months of demons. The mist could hide her body, but could not isolate the temperature. She would have frozen to death if she had walked in the cold wind for less than 2 hours. But Nightingale was unwilling to stay here for more than a moment, for she always felt something in the dark staring at her. It gave her the creeps. If she could, Nightingale would have wished to walk through the mist. Unfortunately, she did not have enough strength to do that. Prolonged usage of strength would quickly exhaust her. Nightingale lifted the torch. On the opposite, rocks were flickering in and out of sight. In the faint firelight, she could occasionally see shadows of different sizes on the opposite cliffs. Nightingale knew that they were caves, so deep that light could not shine, and they looked like a cluster of shadows. In the same position as the cliff close to her, there was also a corresponding deep hollow. This reminded her of the hearsay about the mine on Northern Slope. It was said to be the demon's underground den. From there were many byrods in all directions supposedly dug by monsters. Northern Slope was only one corner of the impassable mountain range. Were these caves connected to the mine? The idea made her shiver. West of the impassable mountain range was the uninhabited barbarian land. Who could dig numerous caves inside these mountains stretching hundreds of kilometers? Perhaps nobody but the monsters, who had survived in barbarian land, could do that. She did not dare to contemplate further, and instead she concentrated on walking forward. Finally, the path in front changed. The shoulder-wide path was divided into two, one slightly upward and the other straight down, extending deep into darkness. Nobody knew where it led to. At the turn-off, she had stronger feelings of being watched, as if countless pairs of eyes were gazing at her in the darkness. It made her mouth go dry and her scalp tingle. Nightingale gritted her teeth, opened the mist and hurried upwards. Soon the strange sensation vanished. With the altitude rising, the surrounding temperature was gradually falling. The silver thread overhead was growing wider and wider. After half an hour, a huge cave appeared on her right. The entrance of the cave was slightly higher than the road. She stepped into the cave and could see faint lights of fire deep within. It was the hideout of the Witch Cooperation Association. Nightingale stepped out of the mist and was immediately discovered by the guarding witch. A black gas wall blocked her way, but soon disappeared into the invisible. In the darkness, the companions' voices cried pleasantly, "You're back." Finally back, she thought, but when she noticed her companion's arms wrapped with 2 pieces of white cloth, Nightingale's mood, which had just leaped, sank again. 2 more sisters. The other person's voice paused for a moment. They were Ari and Abby. They died 5 days ago and didn't make it to adulthood, she said, forcing a smile. This often happens, doesn't it? Don't say this. You can go to the camp. Wendy has been talking about you for a long time. Ari and Abby, a pair of twins born to an affluent family of fallen Dragon Ridge, had at last ended their lives in this deep mountain. Nightingale sometimes wondered whether she had done a right thing. If she had not taken the 2 away, at least they could have enjoyed the rich and healthy life, not having to drift away with the others, before death. But at the thought of Wendy, a warm current surged in Nightingale's heart. If Wendy had not helped her, she would still be a puppet, used as a tool and possibly discarded at any time. Nightingale wanted to tell her the news as soon as possible. And she wanted to tell all the sisters that they did not have to hide like rats, here and there. Some people were willing to accept them. And they could spend their day of awakening every year in peace. Entering the camp, Nightingale saw a familiar figure squatting at the side of the campfire, handling the food. The other witches had not arrived yet. She could not help crying out, "Wendy, I'm back." Wendy was startled. She raised her head, revealing a smile with which Nightingale was familiar. "Veronica, welcome home." Wendy was a very kind-hearted woman, and also one of the earliest members of the Witch Cooperation Association. She was 30 years old, but there was not one wrinkle on her face. Her reddish-brown straight hair was almost waist-length. She had mature facial features, full of charm like a big sister. She cared about every sister in the association. It did not matter whether it was daily life or psychological enlightenment, and she was ready to do whatever she could to help. Had it not been for Wendy, the association would not have been able to gather so many witches so quickly. It was because of her that Nightingale had decided to get away from her family and embark on the journey looking for Holy Mountain. Wendy was also one of the few people who knew her original name. "How many times have I told you that I'm no longer that cowardly little girl?" said Nightingale, shaking her head with a smile. "I'm now a powerful witch, and Veronica has ceased to exist. Your history still belongs to you. To rid yourself of the bad nightmares of the past doesn't mean to sever the links," Wendy said softly. "Of course, it's okay as long as you like to do so. I've been waiting for your return. You have experienced a hard journey. Well." Nightingale stepped forward and hugged. "Thank you." After a while, Wendy asked, "What happened to the girl? You couldn't save her?" Speaking of this, Nightingale was suddenly excited. She grabbed Wendy's arm, and excitedly said, "No, she did not need me to save her. Instead, she saved all of us." Then she recounted her experience in Border Town. "The Lord, called Roland Wimbledon, is the 4th prince of the Kingdom of Greycastle. He's willing to have us in his care. Besides, he promised that in the future he would let the witches in his territory live as free people." Chapter 57, Snake Witch Kara. Yet Wendy did not seem as thrilled as her. Instead, she asked suspiciously, Did he really say that? He did, and he had already saved Anna and Nana before I even got there. The prince has never believed that our power is given by demons. On the contrary, he said the power belonged to our own. Nightingale stopped abruptly, realizing that they did not believe what she was saying. Well, she thought, it was not Wendy's fault. Neither was she convinced of the subsequent new life by merely one witness. Long had they been bullied and oppressed during their journey from the eastern region to the impassable mountain range. It was not rare for them to be sold and discarded, and with the bloody samples in front of them, they had long ago lost their trust in people. She calmed down at the thought. Things had turned a little more complex than she had expected. Wendy, you know that my derivative skill, besides being able to see the flow of magic power, it enables me to tell if people are lying, Nightingale said seriously. I asked him why he had risked so much for the sake of witches, and we don't care about what you're at border town, was the answer he gave to me. He hopes that all witches will have freedom. If he did what he said, he would be targeted by the church. Wendy frowned. Granting that the prince hasn't realized what it means to protect witches, you've known no better. Nightingale could not hold back her smiles and said, at first I had almost the same opinion, and you know how he answered me when I asked him, can you really do that? She paused and stated word by word, he said, you'll never know the answer if you don't try. He wasn't lying. He wasn't lying. Nightingale assured. That sounds incredible. Wendy softened her voice. She could not think of any reason that Nightingale, an old friend, would lie to her. It is. Nightingale shared her feelings. She would have never made up her mind so quickly without witnessing with her own eyes. And it was proven by her power. In retrospect, Roland barely lied, as he had said to her when they were on the wall. During the 2 months that she had spent with him, Nightingale had been very pleased. The only thing he had hidden from her was the actual use of the ice. She hardly cared about the hiding. It would be weird if Roland unveiled all his secrets to a witch he had just met. I'll share the news with everyone tonight when they're all back at the camp. She looked at Wendy and said in a deep voice, I hope you'll help me to persuade them. When night fell, the witches who had spent all day working outside returned to the camp. Seeing that Nightingale had come home safely, they were extremely glad and surrounded her to ask all about her journey. The white bandages tied around their injured arms weighed heavily on her heart. After answering a few questions thoughtlessly, she raised her hands to silence all witches. It took her some time to tell them everything. She began by telling them about the time she snuck into border town, the acquaintance of Roland, Anna, and Nana, then the construction of the wall, the assembly of the steam engine, the fighting against the demonic beasts, and finally Anna, who had just passed through to her adulthood. Nightingale even took out the design of the steam engine to convince others that it was true. Most witches had been cocooned in an isolated world since they joined the Witch Cooperation Association, so it was hard for them to imagine the outside world. They seemed charmed by the stories, and when Nightingale came to the part about Anna passing through the day of adulthood unscathed, they were abuzz. The demonic torture had haunted them all their lives. All these years they had suffered from hunger and cold, leaving behind the secular world and secluding themselves to the impassable mountain range in order to seek the legendary Holy Mountain. If what Nightingale had said was true, a land where the Lord would accept them and a method that would protect them from demonic torture, Holy Mountain seemed less worthy to pursue. Just then, the audience moved to clear a path for a green-haired witch who had half her face tattooed with serpentine. She walked towards Nightingale. "Hello, my respected mentor," said Nightingale, as she bowed to the witch, Snake Witch, Kara, founder of the Witch Cooperation Association. The witches in the association addressed her as mentor. "I've heard your stories," she said with a hoarse and hollow voice, "and you mean to tell us that all we have done is wrong?" "No, mentor, they aren't just stories. I mean enough." She waved her hand impatiently. "I don't know what adventure you have been through, weaving your stories. A highborn prince who pities the poor witches? It's as silly as pitying a frog." She sneered as she turned around. Spreading her arms, she shouted, "Sisters, don't forget all of what the common people have done to you." She went on without waiting for Nightingale's explanation. "There's no doubt that the common people, the incompetents, have targeted us with blades and whips in the name of gods. Without God's stone of retaliation, they have no authority to oppress us. It's deities who grant us the power, not the evils. It should be us who work on the behalf of deities, not the church. It should be us, the Sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association. Holy Mountain, told in old books, refers to the quarters of deities." "What?" Nightingale could not believe her ears. She had known that the leader of the Witch Cooperation Association was kind of eccentric, and although she was hung up on searching for Holy Mountain, she was far from mad. Despite not being as approachable as Wendy, Kara still sincerely cared for them. What Nightingale had not expected was that she would have such hostility toward ordinary people. Had Kara secretly buried her anger and hatred all these years? And what she had claimed, about being detached from worldly affairs, was this really a way to save power for striking vengeance without warning one day? What had made her uncover her disguise now? "Maybe we've found the clue to the opening in Holy Mountain, the same as what we read from the old books. All we have to do is wait. In 20 days, when the blood moon rises in the sky, through a huge gate emerging from underground, we shall reach our final realm." She turned back, looking straight at Nightingale. "The common people have deceived you, and we've lived in a big fraud since we were born. What we've suffered in the day of adulthood is the test given by deities. One who is determined and resilient will obtain the true power. The church," she sneered. "It's just a gang of common people who want to work in the name of deities. Sooner or later, all of them will go to hell. And you, child. There's time for you to stop this." Kara paused. "I'll forgive your ignorance and fault if you forget your stories. We'll retake you as one of us, and together we'll find peace in Holy Mountain." Nightingale's initial excitement had cooled. The suffering was a test? The ones who did not make it through the torture on the Day of Awakening were simply worthless losers? The statements were exactly what the church was advocating. But no one stood out against these ideas, and instead, they wore a face of agreement. Even Wendy did not make a comment. Suddenly all turned dull and boring to her. Standing in front of her, the witch who was the founder of the Witch Cooperation Association and the leader of the witches seemed so unfamiliar. She shook her head. "In that case, I'll take those who are willing to go, and good luck with those who decide to stay." Just as Nightingale was about to take her leave, she felt a faint sting on her leg. She looked down and found a black snake with sparkling blue stripes biting her flesh. The snake of magic, which bore various venoms and was able to strike the target in silence, was often used by Snake Witch Kara. The paralysis struck her hard and quickly. Nightingale moved her lips and struggled to say something, but the darkness overwhelmed her. Chapter 58, Escape. Nightingale did not know how long she had been here, but when she woke up, she found her hands were bound behind her against a stake along with her waist and legs. She struggled to move, but yet she was bound so tight that her body was attached to the stake and got stuck. When she tried to use her power, she could not sense the familiar feeling that she felt every time she induced power. The magic power was disconnected. Nightingale looked down and caught the sight of a crystal prismatic stone hanging around her neck. "You've woken," said Kara, as she walked over. "How do you feel about petrifying venom?" "Nightingale, you know I reposed great hopes in you, and I meant it. Yet, you've disappointed me." Nightingale drew a deep breath and said, "You kept the god's locket of retribution from us. Kara, do you actually know what you're doing?" Their respected mentor chained her own people with the exact lock that was used by the church to hunt down the witches. What made her angrier was those who stood aside and showed no hint of dissent. Nightingale cried out in her mind, "It's just a way to punish some kids who are out of control," Kara said with no regards, "and Nightingale, you're the one who needs to be punished. Or shall I call you Veronica? A girl who fell from a noble and became a witch, yet still dreams of reclaiming her nobility. I don't understand what you're saying. You've disappointed me. I thought you'd stand on our side when Wendy saved you from the chains of the noble. Now, take a look at what you've done. You mean to gut our foundation when Holy Mountain is within our reach." Kara shook her head and sneered. "Take your sisters to a prince? Either you have been chained too long to live without a master to enslave you, or you plan to sell them to the nobles for your nobility. All I've done is for my sisters." Nightingale damped down her rage, for she knew that curses and abuses made no difference here. "All I want is they'll suffer no more tortures on the day of awakening and live a better life, in warm shelters and with enough food. I don't mean to interrupt your plan, and yet they deserve a chance to choose their own life. Many things are changing in Border Town now, and the design of the steam engine that I showed you is one of them. The engine could run itself and hold the enormous power that'll save us from the labor of fetching water from the mountain stream." Kara sneered and said, "This is what you mean?" She turned and pulled out a wad of parchments from hands of a witch who stood behind her, waving in front of Nightingale. "I admit the drawing is too difficult for me to understand, but a lifeless thing built by a pile of cold irons could run itself? You take us for ignorant kids." Walking towards the brazier, she tossed the parchments into fire. "No!" Nightingale cried out in vain, witnessing the drawings turning into ash in the brazier. "You've run out of my patience. I'll give you one last chance," said Carol as she pulled out an iron spike with a hot red tip. "If you confess in front of all sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association that you've been deluded by nobles, I'll spare your life and punish your gullibility with whipping. Otherwise, I'll drive this spike through your heart and nail your body on a stake as a warning," she said word by word, "and don't waste my last bit of mercy. State your decision." Nightingale watched the spike moving towards her, along with the hot wave from the tip. She knew that she was no longer the young girl that she used to be. The girl who had been too weak and coward to stand up and resist. She was Nightingale, a witch with great power that even death would not be able to make bend her knees. She closed her eyes, waiting for the last moment. Somehow, Roland appeared in her mind. "Stop it!" The shouting surprised her, and she opened her eyes, seeing that Wendy walked out of the crowd and said to Kara, "Mentor, please have a look at the bandage bound on your arm. We've seen so many departures over the years, and you want to add one more with your own hands? Why, did she deceive you too? Wake up, Wendy, those stories are lies." "I don't know." Wendy shook her head. "I'm not intending to leave for Border Town with her, but I think she's right in that we deserve a chance to choose our own life." She turned to the crowd and asked loudly, "Is there anyone who wants to go with her?" There were no replies and the crowd fell into silence. So let her go by herself, Wendy said. She didn't undermine the Witch Cooperation Association, and I won't watch you kill her and do nothing. By now, Nightingale had fully understood what Wendy meant. Wendy did not believe her words either. That was why she stood aside as Nightingale wanted her to persuade other witches. Though disapproving her idea, Wendy, who was a kind and caring person, would never let her friend die under such circumstances. The crowd started whispering together about what Wendy had said before some other witches stood out. That's right. If she wants to go back to the outside world, let her. Too many lives have been taken by the church and pains. Respected mentor, please reconsider. Shut up. All of you. Carol's rage soared. What if more girls follow her after we let her go with impunity? What if she betrays us and sells our location to the church? There'll be nowhere to run. Hardly did she finish speaking before she shoved the spike towards Nightingale. But Wendy was faster. She wove a strong wind that blew Kara away. Then she tossed out a coin, and with a wave of her hand, she cast a rapid airflow that wrapped the coin and dashed to Nightingale. The airflow disappeared instantaneously when it neared Nightingale, and yet the inertia of the coin carried it further, hitting right on the god's stone of retaliation that hung on her neck. The hit broke the crystal prismatic stone into pieces. Traitor! Kara struggled to her feet and screamed. She extended both her hands pointing at Wendy and Nightingale, and out of nowhere two snake shadows appeared, one of which opened its mouth and bit hard on Wendy's hand, but yet another that aimed at Nightingale missed. The rope slipped onto the ground, keeping a shape of binding, but Nightingale was nowhere to be found. Kara broke out in a cold sweat at the thought of the opponent's ability, and instantly she aroused all her power to summon demonic snakes. Glittering with various colors, the snakes poured out from her chest, forming a wall of snakes from which she retreated hastily. Yet Nightingale was faster. Taking only one step forward, she emerged right behind Kara, holding out both of her hands. She put the spike that would have been driven into her heart by Kara, directly through Kara's body. Chapter 59, An Explorer. Seeing Kara fall down, all the witches surrounded her in a panic. Respected mentor. Idiot. Kara coughed with pain, her hands clamping to the wound. She could no longer feel her legs. Hurry, go kill that traitor. However, at that time, Nightingale had already disappeared into the mist with Wendy. Back at the crossroad, Nightingale found that Wendy was still in a coma. Her forearm had turned black, and the poison was obviously spreading through her blood. She could not hesitate any longer. She took a deep breath, rolled up the sleeve of Wendy's injured arm and bound the upper arm as tightly as possible. Then she drew a dagger from the sole of her boot, and cut deep into the arm. It took her nearly a quarter of an hour to amputate Wendy's arm completely. She carefully wrapped up the removed arm with her cape and tied it steadily on her back with two straps. As long as she could bring Wendy back alive to Border Town, Nana would be able to heal her and reattach up her arm. But could Wendy bear such pain for so long? It took her 3 days to come here alone, and she would be slower when carrying Wendy on her back. If she walked too fast and accidentally slipped off the cliff, she was unsure whether she would be able to climb back up again. Wendy's arm was still bleeding and she might die in 3 or 4 days. But Nightingale had no other option. She would never leave Wendy behind. After all, Wendy was wounded because of her. Do you need a hand? Startled by the random voice, Nightingale released the mist and simultaneously looked around in a defensive position. But there was no one in front of her. Don't be nervous, I won't hurt you. Nightingale looked up and saw a girl flying in the air. Who are you? I'm Lightning. I just joined the Witch Cooperation Association recently. I usually wander around, so it's natural that you don't know me." She tried to give a reassuring smile. "But I know you, famous Nightingale, the killer in the shadows. Did Kara send you here?" "No, no, you misunderstand me." Lightning slowly fell, one foot treading on the ground. "I want to go with you." Nightingale could not believe what she heard and asked, "Pardon? You said that we should have the right to choose our own way of life." She paused. "I choose to go with you. That's simple." "But why?" Nightingale had been completely disappointed with the Witch Cooperation Association. The sisters refused to go with her, and even Wendy could not fully believe in her. Yet the girl in front of her, she was actually still a child, 14 or 15 years old, about the age of Nana, believed her. She had short blonde hair and a face high in spirits. Her speech and manners were full of confidence that did not match her age. She did not wear the robes of the Witch Cooperation Association, and instead, she was dressed in a fitted coat and trousers. Outside she wore a short and shabby leather jacket with many pockets and patches. Around her waist was a crude-looking belt, which seemed to be picked up from somewhere. At first glance, she dressed like a man. "Because I'm quite interested in what you said. The black machine which puffs out white smoke, the gray powder which will turn into a rock when mixed with water, and the powder which explodes like thunder. I want to see them." She held her head up and said, "I'm determined to be an explorer, so it's only natural I go to any and all interesting places." Nightingale was stunned. However, she knew that the girl was not lying. "I don't understand, why would you join the Witch Cooperation Association if you want to be an adventurer?" "Not an adventurer, an explorer." Lightning stressed. "I'm different from those people who work for money and call themselves adventurers. They're nothing but greedy wolves that will do anything for cash. Explorers only do things that we're interested in." "As for my reason for joining the association," she said confidently, "isn't it a great adventure to look for Holy Mountain? But Kara doesn't have the slightest sense of adventure. She has been totally driven by that ancient book, trying to connect everything we saw with the description in it. She said she had found the stone gates which rose from the ground, but they were just two old pillars. If she keeps on like this, she'll never be able to find the real Holy Mountain. An explorer must honestly record what they see. We can never find a horse by reading its description. My father has emphasized that point again and again." Nightingale had a lot of questions that she wanted to ask. For example, what kind of father would cultivate a daughter full of strange thoughts? But she knew it was not the right time to talk, as Wendy might die at any moment. She was happy to get a hand from Lightning since she was not an enemy. "Is your ability flying?" "Uh-huh." Lightning nodded. "Even if I carry both of you, I can fly like the wind. Then I'll have to trouble you." Nightingale quickly bound Wendy on her back and climbed onto Lightning's back, hugging her tightly. "Ugh, you're so heavy." Lightning gritted her teeth and rose slowly. "Maybe I won't be as fast as the wind." They hurried toward Border Town. When Lightning was exhausted, Nightingale would carry her under her arm to walk through the mist, and when Lightning had recuperated her vigor, she would fly with Nightingale on her back. Only when both of them were exhausted would they stop to take a short rest. At that point, Nightingale would ask Lightning some basic questions about things like her father and her family. Lightning claimed that her father was the greatest explorer in the world, who left his footprints everywhere. He owned an ocean fleet and was kindly addressed as Thunder by the crew. Lightning lost her mother when she was little, so she did not have much memory of her. In a violent storm, Her father's ship hit a rock and sank, and then she was carried to a small island by the ocean currents and lost contact with her father. With the knowledge and skills taught by her father, she managed to live on the island alone for nearly 2 months. When winter came, she awoke as a witch. After that, she flew all the way to the west and arrived in the southern territory of Kingdom of Grey Castle through the strait. She wandered here and there, and finally joined the Witch Cooperation Association. She believed that, as long as she kept exploring, one day, she would be able to meet her father in some wonderful land if he was still alive. Nightingale failed to acquire much useful information from what she said. With her ability, she could only tell whether someone was lying or not, but she could not judge the objective truth of the words. In other words, if someone said that the sun was square and did not doubt it, then her ability would still show that they were telling the truth. Anyway, she could guess from some of the information that Lightning must have been born in a rich family. People who were struggling with poverty would not have the time to explore. In addition, the fact that her father owned an ocean fleet further confirmed it. So Thunder was probably a wealthy ocean-crossing businessman. Besides, Lightning's blonde hair showed that she might come from the fjords across the sea rather than from one of the kingdoms on the continent. Wendy woke up several times, drank some water with Nightingale's efforts, and then she quickly fell unconscious again. Nightingale was increasingly anxious. She felt that Wendy's body was becoming colder and colder. Nightingale and Lightning took turns to hurry forwards, and it took them 1.5 days to finish the 3-day-long path. At the entrance, the horse given by the prince was still tied to the ground, and the heap of straw in front of it was half-eaten. Without catching her breath, Nightingale mounted the horse with Wendy on her back and rushed toward Border Town, with Lightning flying after her. Chapter 60, Arrangements. The second recruitment in Border Town went much more smoothly. Thanks to the winter food rations, the members of militia were given a larger amount of better-tasting food. Many would save their bread and dried meat, and gave them away secretly to their families on visitation day each week. Roland told Carter and Ironax to turn a blind eye, but nevertheless, it became known when families happily talked about the food they brought home. In the first place, a military force comprised of civilians was an excellent chance for publicity. The word-of-mouth approach became even more effective than any announcement the City Hall could make. Most people in Old District were well aware of the militia organized by His Royal Highness by now, where the soldiers were paid a high salary and fed 3 meals a day. The fighting with the demonic beasts was also not as dangerous as they had imagined. Thus, more candidates from Old District showed up compared to the first recruitment. There were even some residents from New District who came to sign up. There were more candidates that met Roland's requirements than he had anticipated. The second militia was thus expanded to 200 soldiers. Carter was appointed to helm their training. When the horn sounded, the new recruits made their way to the city wall and were on the standby as an auxiliary force. Chief Knight Carter and Assistant Minister Baroff raised objections to this. The first militia was already a force capable of fighting demonic beasts, making the recruitment of a second militia unnecessary in their eyes. Never mind the fact that the size of the second militia was twice the size of the first one. The higher food rations and salaries of the soldiers also led to a hike in their financial expenditure. What was worse was that the gold royals they spent did not give them any significant returns. But Roland insisted on his decision. That was because these people were not recruited to fight demonic beasts. At the moment, he dared not to tell his men about the plan he had in mind. He wanted to conquer the stronghold before the Duke could attack Border Town, but he worried that Carter and Baroff would completely shut down his idea. Unlike Border Town, Longsong's stronghold was the official border of the Kingdom of Greycastle. Its city walls were 10 meters high, built of bricks and stone. The Duke and the 6 noble families of the western region were stationed in the inner city, so they could mobilize about 1,000 soldiers at any given time. In theory, it was impossible to conquer the stronghold with his militias made of fewer than 300 soldiers, even if they were equipped with flintlocks, a technology invented in a different era. Besides, the witches could not serve as their secret weapon of decapitation due to the god's stone of retaliation. Roland had confirmed this with Nightingale several times. Duke Ryan and the 6 noble families must have spared no efforts in purchasing the stone. Naturally, this was done in the name of donation. It took several dozens of gold royals for them to trade a single stone, which could seal the power of the witches within a certain range and hence acted as the most powerful weapon against the demons. The stones were thus the biggest annual income source for the church. Roland's only chance was open warfare. Most of the armies kept by the lords in this era were conscription-based, where most soldiers were drafted just before the war. To prevent runaway soldiers, the lords were forced to lead them to the battlefield personally. This gave Roland an excellent opportunity to implement his annihilation plan. However, he was still unsure how to seize this chance. After all, his knowledge of war strategies came from movies, television, or historical stories. He had no first-hand experience with them. Since he could not figure it out, he thought he should focus on the things he was good at instead. He stretched lazily and left his office, heading towards the wooden shed in the backyard. The assembled steam engine too stood quietly in the middle of the field. Upon first glance, it looked more polished than the previous version, and the welding marks were evener. Thanks to Anna's new ability, her green heart fire could penetrate into the tiny gaps for welding, allowing the individual parts to fit better than their last attempt. In addition to a better appearance, Steam Engine 2 also functioned more efficiently, thanks to a newly equipped centrifugal governor. Its existence was remarkable as the first automatic control system and feedback system in history. The structure of centrifugal governor was very simple, consisting of 2 thin hinged rods, each with an iron ball at the end, and 1 rotating spindle. It looked like the bamboo dragonfly, a toy for children. When the bamboo pole was rubbed between hands, the 2 rotating blades would rise into the air because of the centrifugal force. As for the centrifugal governor, the 2 iron balls acted like blades. When the steam engine worked, the spindle would rotate. If the engine output was high enough, the balls would spin faster and gradually rise under the influence of the centrifugal force, leading the rods to reduce the aperture of the throttle valve. When the output lowered, the balls would spin slower and fall because of gravity to increase the valve output again. This would keep the steam engine running with a near constant output. Now that it was speed-controlled, Steam Engine 2 was able to take on sophisticated tasks. And the gears produced by the blacksmith now sat neatly in the corner of the shed. Going by modern assembly line standards, none of the gears would pass the quality check and would be thrown into the defective bin, waiting to be recycled. But in this era, they were rare artistic works. The involute design of the gears carried an inherent sense of harmony, and the gears emitted a unique metallic sheen after being immersed in lard. Besides the gears, the carpenters had prepared the foundations, caps, as well as other parts. He sent the guard outside for Anna, so that they could begin assembling the first steam-driven boring machine together. In Roland's plan, This was the most effective way to mass-produce flintlocks. If he had relied on the work of blacksmiths, the manual production of a single gun barrel would be time-consuming. But with the boring machine, they could directly drill the barrel from the casted iron bars. In one day, they would be able to produce more than 10 barrels. With a change in the cutter, the boring machine could also be used to cut rifling. Fitted with rifling, the flintlocks could be fired with even greater accuracy. With how things were going, he was sure that he could arm his 2 militias of nearly 300 soldiers by the end of winter. However, Roland still could not guarantee that, in the face of charging enemies, his soldiers would be able to calmly load, aim, and shoot their targets, rather than dropping the weapons and running away. The 2 militias had only been in training for a short period of time and had no experience in battling human beings after all. Thus he had to bring out an even more powerful weapon that could obliterate the enemy before they could start their own assault. That weapon was cannon. As the Lord of War in the history of warfare, the lethality and deterrence force cannons commanded were incomparable to flintlocks. A 6-pound field cannon had the range to attack the enemies before they could gather. The mixed-up armies of this era would not be able to keep their discipline under the constant attack of the cannons. As long as Roland could equip his militias with 3 or 4 cannons, his enemy would not even have the chance to charge at them. He had made his arrangements step by step. After he had invented the manual milling machine, he processed suitable gears that he used to build the steam-driven boring machine on the basis of speed-controlled steam engine too. And with the boring machine, he could produce a variety of gun barrels and cannon barrels. There were at least 2 months before the months of demons ended. If his plan worked, the militias of Border Town would have the ability to compete with the Duke's troops in an outright battle. Chapter 61. The Return. As Roland squatted on the ground to install the base, 3 figures suddenly emerged out of nowhere, staggering upon landing, and together falling towards the ground. Anna was startled. A cluster of green flame rose up and transformed into a wall of fire, blocking those figures. Roland looked up and found that one of the women was Nightingale after the long separation. Her appearance looked so discomfited that her cheeks were abnormally red. While the frigid wind was obviously blowing outdoors, her forehead was covered with dense beads of sweat. "Your Highness, please call Nana to come." "Hurry up!" She looked up as she exclaimed in palpable anxiety. Roland had noticed that the woman on her back had a pale face and her eyes were closed, half of the arm was missing, and the crimson blood was seeping through the cloth that wrapped the open fracture. "Carden, go to the hospital and bring Nana here," he shouted at the guard near the door, with a tight heart. "Yes, Your Highness." Other than the 2 people, there was a little girl tucked in Nightingale's armpit. She appeared to be nothing serious, and her eyes looked around curiously. "Are you okay?" Roland went up and untied the cloth belt from Nightingale's back, and removed the woman with the broken arm. "I'm all right, Your Highness. Sorry. I didn't bring the Sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association back," Nightingale gasped, in a weak voice. Apparently she had experienced a long journey that made her exhausted. "Don't say anything. First, take a good rest," Roland said as he picked up the unconscious woman who had been seriously injured and let Anna hold Nightingale. The 5 people went back to the castle. Nightingale's room was next to Anna's. He ordered the maid to fire up the furnace and prepare a vat of hot water in the room. After Nana's arrival, he explained about the issue before she healed the wound, and stepped out of the room when he finished. As long as she was not dead, Nana would be able to recover her from her wound as usual. To keep her life, the problem was not serious. Nightingale also brought back the woman's broken arm to reconnect it. However, the arm had lost blood for a long time. He did not know whether it was possible to connect it back. The next steps would involve undressing to conduct the cleaning and treatment. As a well-educated man in his previous life, Roland consciously chose to avoid it and left the room. But how could things go this way? He thought. Was the camp of the Witch Cooperation Association attacked by the demonic beasts, and only 3 people managed to escape? If that was the case, it was surely a great loss. He was lingering uneasily outside the door. About half an hour later, the door was opened. The first one to get out of the room was the little girl who had come in good condition with Nightingale. She nodded towards Roland. "You're exactly what Nightingale said." Roland was slightly puzzled. What did she say about me? A prince who cares about the witches. She gently shut the door. Unfortunately, the news was too unbelievable. Most people of the Witch Cooperation Association didn't believe her. In fact, I didn't believe her either. But my dad had said that the world is so big with various types of people. "I'm Lightning, Your Highness." "Nice to meet you," she said as she bowed her head, with her right hand on her left shoulder. That was probably a way of saluting. But Roland was not concerned about it. He keenly captured the phrase most people did not believe her. "Has the members of the Witch Cooperation Association been attacked by demonic beasts?" Roland asked. "Attack? No. Why did you ask this question?" She touched her forehead with her index finger, and then revealed a sudden expression. "Ah, I understand. You're referring to the big sister with a broken arm. She's Wendy. She was hurt by Kara, the leader of the Witch Cooperation Association." Then, Lightning roughly told the whole story. Roland was silent after hearing this. It was so unbelievable, he thought. He had really underestimated the brutal oppression of the witches in this world. Accumulatively over the years, the witches' distrust towards the church and the nobility had reached its peak. According to Lightning's story, the priority by the leader of the Witch Cooperation Association, after gaining enough power, might be to eradicate people like me. But fortunately, Nightingale had safely returned. Not only that, but even 2 witches were brought back to Border Town. As for the project of building houses for the witches, Roland thought it over and decided to let Carl go on. "We may not need it now, but we'll get more witches in the future," Roland thought to himself. "Are you a member of the Witch Cooperation Association?" "No," she replied. "Like Wendy and Nightingale, we've already left the association. It's impossible to go back. Kara must hate us bitterly." "Will she be able to survive after being pierced by Nightingale?" Roland asked, frowning. "Probably. There's a witch called Leaf, who can increase the effectiveness of herbs several times." Lightning expressed her thought. "With the more usage of hemostatic grass and blood agent, it should not be a problem to save Kara's life. But compared to your witch, the effect is far worse. It's really a hassle," he thought to himself. "It isn't a worry to be targeted by the church, but it may be a bit ironic to be aimed by witches. Fortunately, the adversary's purpose is to find the holy mountain, and now they shouldn't have enough time to trouble Nightingale." "You said it before that you didn't really believe in Nightingale. Then why did you escape with her from the Witch Cooperation Association?" "Because of the black machine wheezing white gas, and the gray powder able to turn into a stone after making contact with the water, and the snow exploding with a thunderous sound." Lightning repeated Nightingale's words. "The prince that is kind to the witches may not exist. But she should not have lied about all of these to me. Otherwise the story could not have been made so lifelike. It's an explorer's intuition. By the way, The big block I saw in the yard just now, was it the black machine able to blow white gas? Nightingale seemed to call it the steam engine. An explorer? Roland automatically ignored the last question. Yes, an explorer, she repeated the word emphatically. That's why I chose to follow Nightingale here, and the explorer is curious about all of the unknown. Roland secretly sighed. Is it the young people's frivolity? In this era, the people pursuits other than survival must be born in a rich family. Look at her tomboy's dress and short golden hair. Are you sure you're not called Israel? Who is that? I'm called Lightning, said the little girl. Slightly after that, Anna and Nana pushed the door open and came out. How's it going on? Asked Roland. Is the treatment going well? At the sight of Nana's nod, he breathed a sigh of relief. In general, the broken limbs should be connected within 6 to 8 hours. Beyond the time limit, the success rate of surgery would be greatly reduced. Lightning said that they had spent nearly a day rushing towards here from where they were hiding. During this period, the limb's open fracture was in a state of gradual atrophy. The conventional surgery has almost no way to engage with the nerve. I can only say that Nana's treatment ability is really excellent. The little girl also looked a bit tired. The treatment seemed to have consumed a great deal of her energy. Roland encouraged her. You have been working hard. After dinner today, you may go to bed with Anna. Of course, that includes Tigui Pine too, he thought. Chapter 62, The Oath. After all the chaos today, Roland no longer had any mood to assemble the steam boring machine. Instead, he ordered the cook to prepare a particularly luxurious dinner and serve unlimited plates of black pepper steaks and fried eggs. It was enough to stuff Anna and Lightning silly. Even Nana, who tried her best to maintain a proper etiquette, had her lips stained with grease at the end of their dinner. Roland also asked the maids to place stewed shredded pork and wheat porridge in the insulated porcelain and send it to Nightingale's chamber to make sure that the food was still warm whenever they woke up. Once dinner was settled, it was time to decide their accommodations. Fortunately, the previous lord was a pompous person and had his castle built in the standards of a medium-sized town, despite only governing over a budding town. To describe it in Roland's terms, it was a 3-story villa with an executive suite, equipped with towers at its 4 corners. Coupled with a parvis and a garden in the backyard, the castle covered an area of 900 square meters. He arranged for Lightning to stay in the chamber opposite Anna's. The next one was left for Wendy after her recovery. When he saw Nana sticking to Anna like a piece of sticky candy as they entered the chamber, Roland could not help laughing and shaking his head. Roland poured himself some ale after returning to his office. The change in plans was swifter than he had expected. He had expected that Nightingale would bring him more witches that would help him strengthen all branches of technology, such as chemistry, agriculture, and biology. But he had underestimated the hostility that the leader of Witch Cooperation Association harbored against nobles. Witches who were neutral, like Nightingale and Lightning, were rare exceptions. As for Wendy, Lightning explained she had no intention to leave the Witch Cooperation Association. But after Wendy was attacked by the snake witch Kara while trying to rescue Nightingale, she was forced to. Roland thought, as he knocked back his ale. During the dinner, Roland had inquired about Lightning and Wendy's abilities. He learned that Lightning had the ability to fly like a bird, while Wendy had the power to manipulate the wind. These abilities, Roland believed, would contribute little to the development of technology. However, they would be a great help in the upcoming war if used wisely. Moreover, he found out that the powers of the other witches at the camp were varied and random. He could still come up with scientific explanations for some of those powers, but the rest was completely inconceivable. Take the leader of the Witch Cooperation Association, the snake witch Kara, as an example. She could condense her magic power and mold them into snakes. The snakes were not only tangible but also aggressive. The different snakes carried different venoms. As far as Lightning's knowledge went, those venoms were enough to either paralyze or kill. However, be it Anna or Kara, Witch's powers were confined to a close fight. Anna's green fire could only reach as far as 5 meters, while Kara's snakes would lose their power if they strayed too far from their master. Nightingale and Lightning's powers were even more restricted. They were effective only through physical contact. Thus, facing the army of the church equipped with crossbow bolts and God's stone of retaliation, all they could do was to scatter and run. Having spent most of the night in his office, the flame in the hearth gradually dimmed as it reached midnight. Roland sneezed and was about to go to bed. When he opened the door, something unusual caught his sight. Like the last time, he saw a girl sitting by his bedside. Half of her figure was enveloped in darkness, her shadow reflected on the wall like a mural. But it was different this time. Instead of her usual robes, she was dressed casually. And unlike the first time he met her, he now knew her face enough to tell who she was at a glance. It was Nightingale. Roland became nervous. Could it be that his good fortune was here? Noticing the prince's entry, Nightingale stood up and walked over to him. She had recovered a lot in the brief time she had rested. Rosiness took over the paleness in her cheeks, and her hair had recovered its shine. He had to admit that the ability of witches to heal themselves was extraordinary. "You've suffered." Roland coughed, breaking the silence. "Why don't you take more rest?" "I've heard everything from Lightning." Nightingale shook her head. Roland could tell something was off, for her face was solemn and her eyes were full of indescribable persistence. The resoluteness that was rare even on a man's face made Roland realize that she seemed to have made a decision. He hid his other emotions and waited for her to speak. Yet Nightingale remained quiet. She drew a deep breath and kneeled, raising her dagger in her palms above her lowered head. This was the greeting manner of knights and nobles who wanted to pledge their fealty to their superior. "Prince Roland Wimbledon, I swear an oath to you in the name of Nightingale and Veronica," she said bluntly. "As long as you treat witches well, I swear to serve you, whether as a shield against demons, or as a blade piercing the darkness. I swear my loyalty from this day to the end of my life, without fear and regret." Roland thought. As a time traveler, Roland ought to reject her. He preferred working together via employment or partnership, or even better, comradeship with the same dreams and ambitions. Yet he knew it was pointless to harp on equality and freedom. Without soil suitable for growth, planting seeds was a worthless act. As a prince, he could never deviate from his aristocracy before he united the entire kingdom. After a moment of silence, Roland took the dagger and tapped her shoulder 3 times with the flat side of the sword. "I accept your fealty." Nightingale's shoulders trembled slightly, as if she could finally relax. Roland reached out his right hand to her. Nightingale took his hand and kissed it gently. Thus, the accolade came to an end. Although it was strange for a witch to swear her loyalty, Nightingale's ability to do so showed that she was at least not lowborn. She had even mentioned the name Veronica. "Is that your true name? Without your family name?" Roland asked, pulling her up. "Yes, Your Highness. I don't mean to hide it from you. I left the Gillen family 5 years ago and have nothing to do with them since," Nightingale answered calmly. She had let down the last of her walls around Roland and gave him a brief explanation of her past. She was born in Silver City, named after the silver mine there. Her father was a viscount while her mother was a lowborn. Though such a marriage was uncommon, they lived a happy life together. Nightingale had a younger brother named Hyde. She grew up in Silver City, where she spent the happiest time of her life. Chapter 63, The Story of Nightingale's Past. Before long, things changed. When she was 14, the refugees rebelled in Silver City while her parents were out doing charity work. Her parents never came back. Nightingale and her younger brother were sent to his father's brother, another branch of the Gillen family. In the winter of the same year, Nightingale awakened and became a witch. With great care, she hid her power, but yet the old Gillen discovered it anyway. He took her brother away, and with her brother's life, he threatened her to follow his command. Nightingale had no choice but to obey. After being trained by the members of the Thieves' Guild invited by the old Gillen, she had to do illegal things for him, which included stealing the contracts and papers from the houses of his business rivals, eavesdropping on the meetings of the city hall, and, what was worse, even poisoning the water in wine glasses or water tanks of his potential rivals. The business of the Gillens boomed, but yet the old Gillen treated her worse. He beat her whenever he felt bad. She was often locked in a room closed with steel bars and was forbidden to go out unless she was outside under his order. What confused and hurt her most was that her younger brother barely visited her. She started to suspect that her younger brother had been murdered by the old Gillen. As Nightingale pleaded over and over again, the old man finally brought Hyde over, who, on the contrary, despised her and wished that they were not siblings. He told her to go to hell and live with demons as a witch should do. Nightingale was shattered to hear it, yet the nightmare wasn't over. The old Gillen told her a truth that hit her harder. It was Hyde who informed him that she was a witch in order to get away from her, the farther the better. After sending Hyde away, the old Gillen warned her grimly that whenever she disobeyed him, he would secretly kill her younger brother, who would inherit their father's title when he came of age. In despair and deep grief, Nightingale became a puppet of the Gillen family. In the year when she was going to pass to her adulthood, she came across Wendy who, perhaps, had found her on purpose. Nightingale's broken heart, in little sparks, began to light up again when she heard of the Witch Cooperation Association that had witches who suffered as much as her and yet still fought for a better life. It did not take her long before she transformed from confusion to determination. A week after they had met, she survived the torture on the day of adulthood, and her power improved tremendously. She found out that the mist was more than a form of concealment and no bars would block her way anymore. One night after she healed from the torture, she walked into the old Gillen's chamber like a ghost and cut his throat with a dagger. Seeing the blood spurting out and his breath turning staccato, she was surprised to find herself more peaceful than she had imagined. After that, she left the house with little concern for her younger brother, Hyde. She and Wendy started their quest for the Witch Cooperation Association. After the story was finished, Nightingale waited a moment, and seeing the prince was still deep in the past story, she took off. It took Roland a long time to revive. Indeed, every witch had a long story of suffering, and those who survived to reach their adulthood must truly be the best. How lucky he was to become a prince through time travel. The next morning, Roland visited Wendy in Nightingale's chamber. Wendy looked much better after a night's recovery, and her reattached arms also regained color. She struggled to bow to the prince regardless of the weakness. "I've learned of your story. Thank you for saving Nightingale's life." Roland pulled out a piece of parchment and came straight to the point. "There's no doubt that Kara would never accept you as one of them again. I hope you can settle in Border Town and serve me. Please sign the contract if you agree. Your payment is the same as Anna's, 1 gold royal per month." "Your Highness." Nightingale blinked, trying to say something, but she held back. Roland knew what she wanted to say. Nightingale did not want him to push Wendy to make the decision so hastily, for Wendy had changed her life and saved her once again in the impassable mountain range. She believed that Wendy would certainly change her mind and back Roland after living in Border Town for some time. "I didn't want to raise this subject so hastily, but danger grows as things delay." Roland paused for a moment. Wendy did not interrupt, waiting for him to go on. "I guess, maybe I know the method to help witches detach themselves from the torture of the Day of Awakening." Their expressions changed. At the same time, they asked, "What?" "It's just a guess with no firm proof," Roland said, waving his hand. "Witches suffer less at the camp than in exile. The only difference between them is when in exile the witches hide their identities and powers for the fear of being revealed, and when at camp they have to keep using their power to run the camp." Wendy nodded. "You're right. Anna has trained herself every day since she lived in the castle. She even exhausted her power and sank into a coma before the day of adulthood. She passed through the hardest barrier safely before waking up, unscathed. So I believe that this is the key to dispose of the demonic torture. If we liken a witch's body to a vessel that holds her power, the power grows with her, and when the gross power exceeds the volume of the vessel, it'll contract and harm her body. In the months of demons, the power in the body hits the top. So if a witch can constantly release her power and keep it on a safe level, the torture will ease a lot or diminish on the Day of Awakening." Roland paused, and then went on. "As the Lord of Border Town, I can offer witches the places where you could release your power freely without being arrested, charged, or being executed directly. If I'm not wrong, there's no doubt that Border Town is the holy mountain you've been seeking for so long. Since they were born, witches were taught that the dangerous power was given by demons. Some slightly enlightened witches viewed the power that would bite the owner as a curse. It was an infinite loop, which meant that the less time you used the power, the more serious the feedback damage became. But Roland, who had traveled back in time, viewed the power in an opposite way. Having learned from the memory of Prince Roland and excluded the existence of true God, he simply treated the power as an energy that the witches could control with their own will. Wendy was silent for a long while before she asked, "What do I need to do if I sign the contract and come to your service?" During centuries, due to their unique powers, some witches were secretly chained and used as consumables by some men of ambition. The stern ban on it enforced by the church did not hold back those men's claws. They enslaved the witches with no mercy, and what happened to those who were no longer valuable was appalling. Roland certainly heard about those things, but he had a long-term view and wanted more. He wanted a win-win sustainable development system. He smiled and answered, "The first thing you need to do is train your power over and over again until the moment you could fully control it. Just like Anna." Chapter 64, Curiosity. 3 days later, in the castle garden. Sister Anna. Nana pulled Anna's sleeve. "Yes?" Anna turned her head. "Did you notice Nightingale has been acting a bit strange lately?" "Strange?" Anna paused for a bit. "Are you referring to her dress?" Nightingale stood beside Roland. She was not wearing her usual strangely decorated coat, which she did not seem ever to wash or change. Instead, just like Anna, she was wearing the bizarre outfit that Prince Roland invented. Although Anna did not want to admit, Nightingale's slim and tall body indeed amplified all the merits of that outfit: her well-proportioned legs, skinny waist, and that long curly hair. Collocated with the clock and peaked cap, she would have caught everyone's attention. "I'm not talking about the clothes," Nana mumbled. "Don't you feel that the way she speaks to Prince Roland and the way she looks at Prince Roland are very different now? Is it?" Nana quirked her lips. "All right, Sister Anna, don't blame me for not warning you." Anna shook her head and paid no attention to Nana. Instead, she focused her attention on the two new witches. The one named Lightning looked about similar age as Nana, but her style of dressing was distinctly different. Anna roughly counted that there were at least 12 sewed pockets on Lightning's coat. As of the other witch, Wendy, she was wearing casual outfit instead of the same decorated cope of Nightingale that Wendy wore on her first arrival. There was one aspect of Wendy that especially caught Anna's attention. It was that the size of Wendy's breasts was rather impressive. "Since all of you agreed to sign the contract, then let's begin our first training." Roland was now doing the tasks with ease as he had the experience in training the previous two witches. "Lightning, you first." "Okay." Lightning raised her hand and walked out of the shack. There were flurries of snow outside with no wind. The young girl easily floated to the midair and waited for Roland's next instruction. "Try to fly as fast as you can." Roland raised his head and said out loud, "Aha, here we go." She made a thumb signal, positioned into a running pose, and then started to run around the castle swiftly. Roland estimated that the speed was about 60 to 80 kilometers per hour, based on his experience of driving on the highway every year when he went back to his hometown. The speed was not fast, similar to the airspeed of pigeons. However, it was impressive that she was able to carry both Nightingale and Wendy along when she flew to border town. What was the idea of being able to carry 100 kilograms of weights when taking off? Roland imagined a piston engine that was carrying 100 kilograms of aerial bombs. However, the following experiment broke his wonderful illusion as the weight was exceeding 50 kilograms. Lightning's flying altitude drastically dropped from the previous flying altitude of 100 meters to only about 10 meters. When the weight was added to approximately 100 kilograms, Lightning would barely fly up to 2 meters. This meant that if Roland wanted to transform Lightning into a bomber, even with explosive bags that weighed only a couple of kilograms, she would have still run into the enemy's crossbow range due to her flying altitude. However, Roland soon discerned the new capability of the young girl. She would be the perfect candidate for either investigation or firing. The annihilation plan that had been bothering Roland seemed to have a possibility now. When Roland was testing Lightning's power, Wendy was quietly watching Roland from aside. After Wendy's departure from the cloister, she had seen countless people in her 15 years of wandering life: plebeians, farmers, artisans, soldiers, and the noble. Those people had all acted the same. They expressed their admiration and amorous feelings to her when they did not know that she was a witch. When they found out, all of their previous adornment to her would turn into abhorrence and fear, at the same time with the despicable lust that made Wendy want to puke. She thought that she would have only a company witches in her life, and would no longer approach any men. This was the reason that she rejected Nightingale. It was not due to distrust, but rather the fear that obsessed her. However, Roland Wimbledon changed her views. The way he looked at her was too normal, as if he had seen her countless times. The first moment that Wendy saw Roland in Nightingale's room, she thought it was because that Roland was hiding his emotions very well. Besides, Nightingale was there too. However, in the following few days, he also had carried the same expressions. Perhaps Prince Roland's standards were higher than the ordinary noble? And for that roll of contract, Wendy thought that it was merely a pretentious act. However, as she was reading it, she discovered the numerous provisions that not only regulated responsibilities, but also clarified her granted rights. How incredible! Prince Roland was willing to take the witches. It was already very generous of him not to deprive their freedom, but he even notified their rights on the contract. For instance, Art. 2.1, she was granted with paid vacations. According to the following definition, it meant that she could receive remunerations without having to work. The following article stated that the witch should complete the project assigned by the employer, but if the witch felt difficult in completing the project, she could propose to switch or reject it. The next article said that the employer should guarantee the security, housing, food, and remuneration for the witch. If this portion of the conditions was not satisfied, the witch could terminate the contract on her own. These articles were a bit difficult to read but fully expressed their meanings. The contracted wives were not the prince's belongings. Wendy was granted with responsibilities in accord with her rights. In this contract, she felt the sincerity of Prince Roland. If it were merely a pretentious act, there would be no need to list such detailed articles. Coming to this conclusion, Wendy could not help looking at Nightingale. Wendy knew very well Nightingale's personal experiences and knew her deep loath toward the noble. However, as of this moment, when Nightingale was talking to Roland, her tone and expression showed a different kind of emotion, a change that perhaps even herself was unsure. It was only 2 months after Nightingale left the witch group and went to Border Town. Through the 2 months, Nightingale developed a complete trust toward this young man. She would instead end with the Witch Cooperation Association to return to Border Town. In her heart, Roland Wimbledon had more possibilities than the Witch Cooperation Association in bringing the witches to their true sanctuary. The act of her respected mentor was also heartbreaking. That founder of the Witch Cooperation Association seemed to forget how hard it was for every surviving sister. Wendy knew that she could not return. If fate brought her to the place, why would not she trust Nightingale's decision? Just like how she trusted her for numerous times. Wendy came back to the reality from her thoughts. She found that Lightning had already completed the capability test, and everyone was looking at her. She showed an apologetic smile and headed to the outside of the shack. Since she had made her determination, then she should not lose to the younger generation, right? At that moment, the buzzing noise of horn came from the west side. The sound reverberated among mountains and broke the serenity of the town. Chapter 65, The Inauspicious Omen. He had heard the horn go off several times before. In most cases, it was when dozens of the demonic beasts came to assault the border. The militia now could handle such situation with ease. Therefore, Roland did not panic at all. He announced to suspend the training for today, asked Wendy and Lightning to go back to the castle for rest, and Anna to escort Nana to the medical center for patients, and he himself rushed to the city wall with Nightingale. Unexpectedly, Lightning opposed. As an explorer, I have resided in the western region for so long but haven't even seen a large-scale assault of demonic beasts. That's disgraceful and humiliating. I request to come along. Without a second thought, Roland rejected Lightning's protest and told Wendy to keep an eye on Lightning, strictly forbidding Lightning to run around at a time when the demonic beasts were assaulting. He then looked at Nightingale. The latter nodded her head, grabbed his hand, stepped into the mist, and went straight to the city wall. When Roland found out that Nightingale was able to bring any objects with her into the mist, he soon addicted to such a transportation method. Traveling straight through roadblocks and ignoring the topography, with several meters in one step, this gave Roland the pleasure as if the world was his camp. After arriving at the foot of the city wall, Roland found a vacant corner to step out of the mist and went on the defensive line alone. The wilderness from the far side looked snowy white. He did not see a large-scale assault of the demonic beasts. Was this a mistake? Not only Roland, the militia that came afterward also had an internal discussion. The prince found Iron Axe and noticed that Iron Axe was staring afar with such a solemn expression while his hand was still tightly holding the horn. "Did you set off the alarm?" "Yes, Your Highness. Please take a look." His voice sounded much drier than usual. "That thing is coming." "That thing?" Roland looked afar but could only vaguely see a small black dot. It was hard to spot it even in a pure white background. According to the rules, the horn alarm would only go off when the patrol team could not adequately handle the situation. However, as an experienced hunter, Iron Axe must have had his reasons. "It's a demonic hybrid." Iron Axe swallowed. "I met it 6 years ago." Roland frowned. Theoretically, demonic beasts would keep assaulting Longsong's stronghold until they died. They did not have intelligence, so they had no idea of retreating. Longsong's stronghold had never been conquered, but it did not die and even lived till 6 years? An inauspicious feeling arose in Roland's heart. However, the distance was so far to the point that he could only saw a black dot. But Iron Axe was able to decipher the type of the demonic beasts. That was a shockingly good eyesight. Or perhaps, Iron Axe misjudged, Prince Roland thought. The demonic beast did not make Roland wait for too long. It started to move toward the city wall. Soon, everyone noticed the unique physical features of that target. Unlike the massive body of the previous demonic hybrid, it looked like an enlarged feline at a glance. However, it had wings on its back that covered the sides of its body when the wings were not expanded. Its head was similar to lions but had 2 pairs of eyes. If the extra pair of eyes was not for decoration, then it could notice any movements from its back without turning its head. Carter and the other hunter had already loaded ammunition and prepared for combat. However, the lion-type demonic hybrid did not rush to attack. It stopped outside of the shooting range of crossbow bolts and looked around. That distance was within the effective shooting distance of flintlock, but the hit rate was almost 0. After a moment, it suddenly jumped to the left side and expanded its wings, making the whole body fly into the midair. Just like what Iron Axe said, it could fly for a short distance to glide. After it got over the roadblocks, the demonic hybrid quickly ran to the west side of the city wall where nobody was guarding. Roland's trepidation grew. The inauspicious omen came true. From how it observed the weakness and strength of the opponent and chose to attack the weak side, it proved that it had intelligence. That was what the wild beasts lacked. The wild animals sometimes would attack the weak side of their prey. However, such was instinctual act through years of inheritance. When facing an unknown opponent, it was impossible for the wild beasts to judge, not to mention to make a comprehensive analysis. What did it mean by owning intelligence? Humans relied on the exceptional brain and outstanding resilience to climb to the top of the food chain from the cruel ecosystem. Roland was afraid to think furthermore. He waved his hand to have Chief Knight Carter accompany him. The rest of the hunters would follow Iron Axe to attack the demonic beast. It ran to a vacant area, jumped and got over the city wall with ease. It moved straight to the residential area. wholly ignored the hunter squad. "Bastard!" Roland cursed. "The militia members from the second range of the city wall, follow me. The substitute members shall go on and guard the city wall." At this point, he could not bother to care the fact that the militia only had fencing training. The team would most likely come apart during the movement and would be attacked by the demonic beasts. Carter led the guards to follow the prince. Every one of them had the strongest fighting capacity, and they could substitute any possible lacks. At the end of the team was the Flintlock team led by Iron Axe. As they entered the old district, their views were blocked by flat houses. Besides, the roads were narrow and covered by snow, so the team had limitations on their movements. Roland had to separate the team and move around in the crisscrossed alley, hoping to find the demonic beast. Roland regretted not bringing lightning. If he had a witch to investigate in the air, then the team would not need to run around the alleys with no directions. They searched for about 8 minutes, and all of a sudden the screams of the town resident came from the deep end of the alley. The team immediately adjusted their direction and moved toward the sound. Fortunately, many of the militia members were residents of the old district. After knowing the destination, they swiftly moved around in the narrow alley and even walked across the backyard of someone's house. When they reached the place, Roland saw someone was bitten into 2 pieces, and the intestine was scattered and apparently dead. "Jesus, this is Iron Fork, I know him. Damn it, did it run away? Watch out! To your right side," someone called suddenly. As soon as the sentence finished, a black shadow whipped across from the right side of the wooden house with the scattering wooden fragments. It came straight through the wall of the wooden house, flew into the group, and pushed down a militia member with its claw and bit him. Iron Axe was the first one to react. He raised the gun and was about to shoot, but found that the defused militia members blocked the alley. He had no chance to fire, so he had to squeeze through the crowd and walk to the target step by step. All the other hunters noticed this problem. They all clung their gun under their arm and jumped onto the roof of the houses. Demonic Hybrid did not care about the guns that were pointing at it. It expanded the wings, blocked the stabs from the crowd, and picked up the militia member that was covered in blood. However, the gun was fired when it was about to leave. There were drips of dark blood on its body. The demonic hybrid roared in anger after being attacked by the gun. It threw off its prey, opened wings and was about to fly into the hunter that was standing on top of the roof. At the same moment, Iron Axe squeezed out of the crowd, aimed at the demonic beast and fired. The near-front shooting was impossible to miss. The hot gas of the gunpowder even sprayed to the nose of the monster. The bullet went straight through the eye of its target and all the way into the monster's brain. The demonic hybrid stiffened and collapsed. Chapter 66, The Battle of Hermes 1. Icy rain trickled down and diluted the blood-smelling air in Holy City. Alicia panted heavily, leaning on her long sword. It was not the first time for her to have taken part in the defensive battles of Hermes. But it had never occurred to her that they could ever possibly lose New Holy City. The city wall was completely destroyed. Alicia had never seen so many horrific monsters in her life. An enormous worm-like hybrid beast scuttled from underground, with its body close to the glacial cliff and its bony claws deeply embedded into the city wall. When it had climbed to the top of the city wall, its whole body had not even fully emerged from the ground. Enormity alone would not matter so much. But to everyone's surprise, the beast opened its wide mouth and spat out countless demonic hybrids, which instantly created chaos on the city wall. The army that had been in order soon turned into a state of commotion under the attack of demonic beasts. The vanguard of the Judgment Army, to which Alicia belonged, were also scattered in this commotion. She saw how her companions were devoured one after another by demonic beasts, unable to help them. Warm human blood mingled with the black blood of the monsters, flowed along the cracks on the flagstone pavement. As the retreat bugle call was heard, the Mongonal and Holy City was also started. Stones as large as a table were hurriedly thrown down, regardless of the soldiers that still fought on the city wall. Alicia remembered how a huge stone had hit Captain Ricardo right beside her. When she got up and stood on her feet again, she saw that he, along with his armor, had been crashed into the cracked pavement. His whole body looked like a creased parchment. His smashed bowels had flown out from his belly, where his hot steaming blood had collected and formed a small puddle beneath him. If she had not escaped the attack of the stone before it was too late, she thought, her end would be just like that of Captain Ricardo. As for how she had escaped and retreated under the city wall, Alicia could not remember clearly. All she could remember was screaming and cursing. Everyone stabbed and chopped anyone and anything with their weapons in madness, not knowing whether they fought with demonic beasts or their own companions. Out of around 100 soldiers of the Judgment Army, there were only 12 left, including herself. What should we do next, Captain? Captain Alicia. Alicia came back to her senses. Right. According to the ordinances of the Judgment Army, when a captain dies in battle, then the duty of the captain naturally fell on the shoulders of the deputy captain of the same platoon, who should lead the platoon in following battles. She bit her lips until she tasted her own blood. We'll go to the north gate of Holy City. If demonic beasts want to attack New Holy City, they'll have to pass from there. This command meant forsaking the city wall and the populated area of the inner city, but she had no choice, for nowhere else could be more important than the pivot of the church, the Hermes Cathedral. What she did not say out loud was a question that lingered on her heart. What could she and the other 11 people do, if the glacial cliffs were incapable of stopping these monsters? Perhaps today is the day for me to sacrifice myself for God's kingdom. May the Lord have mercy, she prayed silently and shouted at the same time, the Judgment Army never gives up. Let's move. The Judgment Army never gives up. Her companions echoed her. The 12 ran to the north gate in a trail formation, while the noises of fighting from the city wall died down in the sounds of wind and rain. When they arrived at the north gate, Alicia saw that quite a lot of soldiers from the Judgment Army had gathered before the drawbridge. It seemed that everyone shared the same idea, the thought of which made her feel a little better. However, the drawbridge was let down even at this moment of crisis. Alicia could not help but frown. She walked to a handsome warrior in the red robe of the Chief Justice and saluted him. Your Excellency Chief Justice, I'm the captain of the 4th Platoon of the Vanguard, Alicia Quinn. I'm Tucker Thor in charge of the defense of Northgate. You have all my regard. The man nodded to her. We've set up a rescue center behind the North Gate. If any of your soldiers are wounded, you can send them to the center. Sir, I don't understand why we don't raise the drawbridge. The demonic beasts on the city wall could swarm here at any minute. We must make sure that we don't lose the inner city. Calm down, Captain. I know you and your men are unafraid of making sacrifices. But you should not sacrifice in vain. The situation is far from desperate for the church. He wiped the raindrops away from his forehead. Await orders now at the gathering point. If cold expelling pills are used up, remember to ask for them from the supply officers. Upon hearing what Chief Justice Tucker Thor had said, Alicia found herself chilling in the wind. After the battle, sweat and cold rain had mingled and made her body freeze. Piercing wind blew in her direction and sent her trembling. She took out a sheepskin pouch from her underclothes pocket and shook the pouch with its opening down to her palm. Yet only some thick fluid dripped down. It seemed that she had crushed the pills in battle. She sighed and raised her head, only to find the cold expelling pill in reddish-brown color being handed to her. "You should take mine." Tucker Thor smiled to her. "You can give it back when you have one." Alicia did not refuse his kindness. She took the pill, bit and swallowed it. "Perhaps we'll never have the chance to eat this thing once again." "Yes, that way it wouldn't be too bad." Tucker went so far as to nod in agreement. "This thing tastes way too bad." Upon these words, a strong fishy smell rose from the stomach of Alicia and gushed to her head. Even battlefields with all their corpses would not smell so repelling. She felt as if what she had swallowed down was no pill at all, but a mixture of long rotten flesh and blood. Unbearable numbness gradually came to every part of her body from the stomach. Chills were suddenly repelled. Instead, glowing warmth started to flow in her veins. Her body resumed its normal temperature while frozen sweat ran down. Her head was steaming. Her numb toes went nimble again. But it should not be today. Seeing her have swallowed the pill, Chief Justice Tucker Thor waved his hand. "God's punishment army is coming from the cathedral. The demonic beasts can't pass through the north gate. Take your men to the gathering point. Remember to check if they all have the pills. They aren't supposed to follow your example and to find there's none when the pills are needed." God's punishment army, the crack troop of the church. Alicia had heard about it for long, though she had never seen it with her own eyes. But no matter how powerful God's punishment army was, it could only be composed of humans. With humans' bodies, no matter how hard they had been trained, there could be no chance of their beating numberless demonic hybrids easily. But since Tucker Thor said so, she could only leave the north gate with her platoon of 11 men and approached the gathering point to the west. Here hundreds of retreated members of the Judgment Army had gathered. They stood dispersed in the field and let rain run down their faces. Some of them even sat on the ground in low spirit. Only a small number of them stood in formation and awaited the enemies that could appear at any minute. If it had been a few days ago, Alicia would have scolded these people. But now she was confused herself. In order to build this new holy city, countless believers had died. Every stone in this city had the blood of believers, and Judgment Army spilled for it. The bishop always said that to own Hermes meant to own Kingdom of God on earth. However, on this day the Kingdom of God seemed soon to fall into the hand of demons' minions. "Demonic beasts are coming!" someone yelled. "Be prepared to fight the enemies." Alicia gathered herself together and held up her long sword. Gazing at the shadows in the sky that were approaching, she shouted, "For Hermes! For New Holy City!" Chapter 67, The Battle of Hermes II. But the expected final battle did not happen. Someone walked to the female warrior and lowered her sword handle. "Step back," he spoke in a soft and clear voice. Alicia noticed that the other party was one of the soldiers who remained in formation. On his arm, he wore the band of regimental commander. "The God's punishment army has come." She turned her head and saw a platoon of tall warriors, one after another, all clad in shiny armor from head to toe which reflected a silvery tone in rain walking through the north gate. They all wore crimson cloaks on their backs and carried various weapons in their hands. Some held swords and shields in their hands, and others held halberds, spears or iron axes. They did not resume formation after crossing the drawbridge, but joined the fight against the attacking demonic beasts directly. What kind of strategy is that? It's child's play. When faced with demonic hybrids whose strength and speed far surpassed humans, the only way to beat them is to keep the formation and fight them collaboratively. Do they want to fight the demonic hybrids individually in this way? Should I just wait aside and do nothing while the God's punishment army fights the monsters? Alicia thought. We have to give them a hand. It would be no use. That man shook his head. He looked gloomy. We should just watch. If we step in too rashly, we can only make things worse. Make things worse? Alicia stared at the man, exasperated. Did I make a mistake about the man? Is he only a coward? She held her sword handle tight and walked past him, ready to join the fight. However uncertain she felt about the future of New Holy City, all she could do was fight the enemy until the end of her life. Before she took another step, the female warrior saw an incredible scene. A flying demonic hybrid was swooping down from the sky. With its gigantic gray wings that stretched nearly 4 meters wide, it seemed to have come directly out of hell. It had the head of a bird with ram's horns on it and 2 claws with barbs that could penetrate the cuirass of any warrior. They were used to attacking by vertical fall, which was covert and made defense extremely difficult. The heavy shield was defenseless in face of the pouncing force. The strong force of impact would crash the arm as well as chest bones of the one who held the shield. There would be no way to survive under that condition. The only way to deal with the fatal attack was to dodge it by rolling aside before the hybrid landed. But no one from the God's punishment army ever dodged. A warrior in silvery armor reached out both his hands a minute before the hybrid pounced on him. He hit the hybrid's claws with his own hands. The pouncing force was so great that it sounded like firecrackers. Mist rose from him and the monster. His armor also groaned under the force. He lowered his body by bending his right leg and kept his back straight. The hybrid was unable to crash him at that moment. Another warrior soon aimed his javelin at this flying hybrid, and a silver light darted before Alice's eyes. She saw the shattered head of the monster. The former warrior tossed the dead body of the hybrid to the ground. His arm was in a crooked, unnatural position. It seemed he had taken damage from the previous attack. Despite the broken arm, he took out an axe from his belt and threw himself toward the other demonic beasts. Alicia could not believe her eyes when she saw how humans had been successfully resisting these monsters. Hundreds of God's punishment army warriors had sprung to the herd of demonic beasts. Their crimson cloaks looked like a river of blood that prevented the enemies from taking one more step. She now understood what the regimental commander meant by making things worse. Every one of these warriors had the power to fight 10 demonic beasts, for their strength, agility and speed could be compared to those of demonic hybrids. No, even better than them. Common demonic beasts would mean nothing in front of them. They're just wonderful. Alicia beamed with happiness. With these powerful warriors, Hermes Cathedral could not be lost to the enemies. Ah! I haven't known your name yet. I'm Alicia Quinn, a captain in the Judgment Army. You seem to have known about the power of the God's Punishment Army? The other party looked at her with his eyes that were as cold as the icy rain. He did not tell her his name but said, "My brother is a warrior in the God's Punishment Army." "We seem to have won." At the dome of the cathedral, Archbishop Maine said with a telescope in his hands. Here was the pivotal point of New Holy City. One can easily overlook more than a half of the battlefield from here with the spyglass of Fjord's merchants. Make the Mongonal stop. The God's Punishment Army will soon arrive at the top of the city wall. Isn't the victory a sure thing? The other answered. He wore the same golden archbishop's robe as Maine. Yet his voice sounded hoary. The most important thing is the armies of the four kingdoms are all crashed. Right. In this way, their defensive force on the border would be weakened so much, the last one among them said. She was the youngest among them, no more than 30 years old, and the only female among the 3 archbishops. A standing army of 5,000 well-equipped and well-trained men, plus nearly 1,000 knights. Even if one set off replenishing the force immediately from now, that would still take 4 to 5 years. She exclaimed, what a wonderful and malicious scheme. But to reach this end, we've lost many men of the Judgment Army. They're all core forces of the Church. Main side. If any other plan could have worked as quickly as this, I wouldn't have tossed them into this hell. The old man touched his beard and said, we have no other choice. Just like our holy book has told us, wilderness beasts have emerged. There's little time left. If we can't unite the whole continent and integrate all the forces, only doom awaits us. Doom isn't bad at all. The woman smiled provocatively. Humans are greedy, malicious, and short-sighted. They do things which are more horrible than what demonic beasts have done. The devil in hell may be kinder than us. Heather. The old man bristled with anger. What you've said was heresy. Are you trying to disobey God's command? You don't have to worry about that, Lord Ch51. Heather shrugged her shoulders disapprovingly. I'm the one who's in charge of the tribunal, not you. Besides, does God command that we should survive? How do you know whether or not he would care more for the devil? You. That's enough. Ch51. Heather. Maine said scathingly, that's enough for today. Later on, I'll report the whole situation to the Pope. Now you should both finish your own business. When the two had left, Maine stood before the French window and looked toward the north. Behind the fracture of the impassable mountain range lay the snow-covered land of Everwinter, and to the west of it was the barbarian region, where everything began. He knew that Archbishop Ch51 was right. God's punishment warriors were too rare. They were only chosen and trained from the ones who were most faithful to the Church and had the strongest will. With almost 100 years of efforts by the Church, there were still no more than 1,000 people in this army, whose number was far from enough to fight against the demons. But those were all that the North could provide. If they wanted more forces, there was no alternative to uniting the continent. Of course, what Archbishop Heather said was also right. She had brought 10,000s of criminals and witches to trial. But all the trials that the criminals and witches had gone through were not half as cruel as the deliberate Pyrrhic victory of today. The higher one's status was in the Church, the more one could feel that God was neither good nor evil. How do you know if he would care more for the demons? Thinking of Heather's words, Maine could not help but laugh out loud. Only she could make Lord Ch51 sore and speechless. It was only that, he thought to himself, God didn't care for the people on earth, as he didn't care for the devil. He only cares for the one who wins. Chapter 68, The Funeral. The funeral was held on a wasteland on the southwest side of Border Town. It was not appropriate to call it a wasteland. Yet this piece of land that no one cared about was already surrounded by a small fence of rubble, and the wall covered with thick snow. From far, it looked like a silver lining. Although one could cross over with 1 foot, yet looking at it, Vanner still unwittingly thought of the border city walls. They were the same color, the same shape. He heard of this ritual from traveling businessmen. When a great noble or member of the royal family member died, the deceased's family would gather at the cemetery, where sad tunes were played and people mourned before the coffin was finally buried underground. The higher the status, the more pompous the occasion would be. The dead got more attention than the living. He thought enviously at the time. What happened when someone from border town passed away? Probably a pit would be dug and filled at the edge of the misty forest. Who could know if the demonic beasts would dig out the corpse and eat it during the months of demons? Death was always familiar to the inhabitants of border town, especially every winter on the way to seek refuge in Longsong's stronghold. Everyone would cram together in the shacks of the slums. Dying of hunger and cold, or illness and pain, was quite normal. No one had time to be sad. It would make more sense to save this energy to beg for more bread in the city center when the dawn came. But today, His Highness went so far as to arrange a funeral for a soldier. It was rumored that the soldier was in the pursuit of a hybrid demonic beast when he was thrown to the ground and had half his head bitten off. Vanner knew this unlucky guy, who was considered a familiar face at the old district. He had no name and everyone just called him Ollie. He had a wife and 2 children. The older one was about 6 years old, and the younger barely started walking. In usual cases, this family would be over. The woman could find another man. But who would be willing to take care of the 2 children? The 2 little ones could be stranded on the road so that they could learn to feed themselves. Or the mother would still keep them by soliciting clients at a bar and finally die of a variety of strange diseases. But His Royal Highness seemed trying to honor his commitment when he recruited the militia. In case of sacrifices during the war, one would not only receive all the pay, there would also be an additional compensation. What was it called again? Vanner thought. Ah yes, the pension. And this money was worth 5 gold royals. In addition, provisions of food and charcoal would be issued every month. This meant that Ali's wife could take care of the 2 children even if she did not work. Well, these benefits could hardly be counted upon, but the gold royals were undoubtedly real. He saw His Royal Highness place the pensions into the hands of the chief knight, who then transferred it to Ollie's wife. Hell, why did he suddenly feel a little envious of Ollie? No, no, Vanner shook his head repeatedly to expel these silly ideas. He did not want his wife to benefit from his death, and she most likely ended up as someone else's wife. After distributing the money was the address of His Highness. It was very short, but it touched Vanner. Especially the phrase, "We'll never forget those who have sacrificed their lives to protect loved ones and the innocent." After hearing this, he felt a surge of warmth in his heart. That was why recently, in addition to the bread and silver royals, he always felt he had some other pursuits. At least this winter, they survived, relying on their own hands, and not the charity of Longsong's stronghold. The last part was the burial. Ollie's coffin was placed in the dug pit. Chief Knight let everyone queue up, and every member of the militia, whether he was a formal member or a substitute, stepped forward with a shovel to fill in a row of soil. As for queuing up, everyone was familiar with it, so more than 200 people immediately formed 4 columns. When it was time for Vanner, he suddenly felt that the shovel became slightly heavier. The attention of his platoon members around him also slowed down his every action. After he stood aside, his eyes transferred this feeling to the next in line. The tombstone of Ollie was a pure white rectangle stone, and Vanner did not understand a single word on it. Ollie was not the first person to take residence in this wasteland. Next to Ollie's was a tombstone of the same design, the top of which was covered with snow. When everyone left, Vanner saw the new captain, Brian, pour a pot of ale slowly on the tombstone. If this was his own destination, it did not seem bad. He could not help but think so. "Your Highness, on the way to the castle," Carter suddenly spoke. "You did that too. Was that inappropriate?" "No." He thought and finally shook his head. I can't tell. I just think that no one has ever treated the recruited subjects like this. They have neither title nor family background, not even surnames or names. But you still felt good, right? Roland smiled. Of course, he knew how strongly this idea would appeal to Carter, who also saw honor in fight and guardianship. When people start thinking about for whom and why they were fighting, the platoon would undergo unimaginable changes. There was a deep significance for Carter. One's honor was no longer the privilege of the noble alone, and through his training and teaching, the civilian population who had nothing could also obtain honor by defending their homes. His doubled sense of accomplishment was simply indescribable. Of course, the public funeral was just a beginning, Roland thought. He still had many means that could be used to enhance the collective sense of honor, such as the design of a military flag, the composition of a military song, the choice of a model hero, and so on. Every kind of spirit had its own origin. Only the relentless practice day after day would instill the idea and gradually achieve results. In order to ensure the reliable operating system in the future, he even arranged a small team consisting of himself, the city hall, the militia team to ensure that the follow-up food and charcoal were continually distributed. As things progressed, Roland felt that his burden was getting heavier. Border Town was still too backward, though people's livelihood had started to get on track. There was adequate food reserve, and so far no one had starved or frozen to death. This would have been a miracle in other cities. Even in the King's City, the capital of the Kingdom of Greycastle, the winter wiped out many refugees or orphans every year. But he wanted far more than that. The city hall's operating load had already reached the limit. All financial and administrative management relied on Assistant Minister Baroff and his dozen apprentices. If he wanted to further expand the department, he had to recruit some managers. He had once asked Baroff if there were any capable students or colleagues left in the King's City, but he received a cold reply. Even if there were, they wouldn't be willing to come. Your Highness, do you realize how bad your reputation is in the King's City? He thought unhappily. Back at the castle backyard, Nightingale stepped out of the mist and gave a warm embrace to Wendy, who was waiting outside the wooden shed. Lightning hung around the unfinished steam boring machine, and once she saw Roland, immediately insisted she wanted to help assemble this automatic machine. Looking at this scene, he suddenly felt that his efforts had been worth it. Chapter 69, Producing Cannons. 4 days later, a firing room was built in the backyard at North Slope Mine. 2 deep holes were dug in the yard, each one was round, with a narrow top and a wide bottom. The front diameter was about 20 centimeters, while the rear end was enlarged to 26 centimeters. Roland intended to use these holes to cast the mold. The hole had already been baked by Anna, and the surface of the soil was sintered into a hole like an outer shell. The chamber faced downwards so that a better wall quality could be achieved during casting. If the chamber were placed higher, more dross and bubbles would be produced. All the cave sizes were calculated by shells, as he vaguely remembered that the so-called 6-pound and 8-pound cannon were named according to the weight of their shells. So a few 12-pound iron balls were poured out, and the ball diameter plus barrel wall thickness were used to calculate the mold diameter. Roland decided to customize the standard himself since he had no measurement tools. He intercepted a section with his own ring finger and set it as a centimeter. He then used this method to produce other sizes of iron bars and engraved the section lines. A 12-pound iron ball diameter roughly measured about 12 centimeters. He set the thinnest wall with a thickness of 4 centimeters. The back of the chamber had its wall thickness expanded to 7 centimeters, in order to prevent bombing. Thus the mold diameter could be obtained in this way. As for its length, although he knew that the cannon was measured by its caliber, he could only remember the caliber of battleships and cannon tanks. As for antique light guns, he really had no idea. He also took into account that a shorter tube would not only be lighter but would also be cost-effective and reduce the amount of material needed. So Roland casually came up with the figure of 1.5 meter, knowing that if the test results were not satisfactory, this figure could still be adjusted in the future. When the cannon was first invented, it was made of iron on the wooden core and sealed with iron powder. Then it was reinforced with iron hoop, before the core would be burned away in the burr-hole, just like the barrel storage. Roland knew that this type of cannon had a high risk of bombing due to gas leaking, so he decided to use the overall casting and the boring machine drilling process. As for the steam boring machine, whether it was drilling a 6-pound cannon or a 12-pound cannon made no difference in the level of difficulty. He also believed that the caliber equated to justice, so he chose the 12-pound cannon, which had a larger muzzle and a thicker barrel. If it got any bigger, it would not be easy to use as a field artillery. As for the weight of the shell, whether it was calculated as a shot or an iron ball was not important, as long as it could shoot out. After all, he was just drawing on the experiences of history, and not imitating everything. "Let's start," said Roland, taking a deep breath, facing Anna. The latter nodded, grabbed a piece of steel ingot, and hung it over the top of the hole. Green flames ignited. The ingot quickly turned red, and then melted, forming a small molten waterfall, which flowed into the hole. The steel surface was red and orange, the core became incandescent, and its brightness was difficult to look at directly. In order to protect the witch's eyesight, Roland also deliberately set up extra support for her in the hole. She only needed to determine the location in advance and place her arm on the support pad. Then she would not need to stare at the liquid steel to observe whether it flowed into the hole. These steel ingots were slowly accumulated over time. Anna alone would not be able to kickstart the great steel-making era, but producing a small batch was easy for her. Once the temperature issue was solved, frying the steel would be able to produce more high-quality steel. This was also why Roland dared to customize the size of the barrel. Compared to pig iron or bronze barrels, steel cast barrel was obviously stronger. Even if the size was not right, the cannon would still not bomb easily. The liquid steel gradually increased, while the steel ingots were swiftly used up. Roland felt some heartache as he saw this. How long would it take before he could build a pile of chimneys and blast furnace on his domain so that he could refine an endless amount of steel? For a long time, steel production was one of the criteria to measure the power and strength of a country. He finally understood the reason for that now. Anna's cheeks became glowing red after filling the 2 molds. Roland saw this and took out his handkerchief to dab the sweat from her nose. At the beginning, Anna showed a little resistance towards Roland's touch, but now she would stand still and allow Roland to do so with her eyes closed. Her falling bangs looked red on the edges as they reflected the liquid steel, while the softness of her neck seemed to invite a nibble. As he was much taller, he could see the exposed half of her delicate clavicle. When they were close to each other, he could get a whiff of the fragrance from her body. "Well, okay." Roland put away the handkerchief and suppressed his passion. "Let's call it a day. You did well, and I'll inform the kitchen to reward you with an extra slice of black pepper steak." He thought, "This will look like I'm taking advantage of her. Wait till she's really free." Anna opened her eyes. Although the sweat had been wiped away, her face seemed redder than before. She nodded towards Roland and gently said, "Yes." In addition to the barrel, he also needed to produce a sufficient amount of boring knives. This tool for drilling was produced in the same way as barrels. The diameter and shells were exactly the same. Once removed from the mold, Anna would heat it again, and rely on hammer processing to mold it. It was very different from the shape of a screwdriver, and it looked more like a blunt iron bar. The only difference was that the head had a gap knocked out for the discharge of metal debris. Finally, quenching was used to improve the hardness of the boring knife. Unlike modern high-precision boring machines, Roland only needed a rod that could drill holes. Taking into account the high wear and tear rate, he and Anna made 5 of these simple boring knives in a week. Prior to this, the steam boring machine had already proven its ability. The production of pig iron barrels increased rapidly from 2 per month to 10 per day. When everything was ready, the cannon was mined by the miners from the pit, cleared of surface scum, and transported to the blacksmith's shop. The 2 cannons almost exhausted the rolled steel accumulated by Roland. Steel was definitely a priceless commodity. During transportation, the prince ordered Carter and 2 knights to guard them the whole journey. Chief Knight felt arranging the extra security was not necessary. Who would steal such a heavy thing? The blacksmiths carried out leveling and polishing of the appearance of the cannons at the request of the prince. After polishing, it was transported to the castle backyard. At this point, the 2 rounds of solid steel stick appeared dark gray and emitted a thick metallic luster. Roland could not wait to put on the boring tool and put the cannons in place together with Carter. The top of the knife needed to be in the center of the steel bar. Roland pulled off the steam engine door at this historic moment. The boring knife began to move slowly and it did not take long to rise to a stable speed. "Come on!" the prince shouted. The chief knight activated the sliding base to control the amount of contact between the cannon and the boring tool. When the head touched the barrel, the harsh noise suddenly overshadowed the roar of the steam engine. Lard was used as a lubricant and squeezed into the hole, before black foam and the metal curls gushed out. The witches there started to withdraw from the wooden shed, but only Lightning insisted on remaining. She felt that these swarthy machines were more beautiful than any scenery. Chapter 70, The Spy Part 1. Groundhog Cole looked anxiously out the window. Once it started snowing in this forsaken place, it would not stop. Though the sky looked like his grandmother's unwashed bed sheets, both dirty and gray, he still had other ways to tell the hour. It was the training of the militia. As long as the weather allowed, they would run through the square in the town center every morning when the birds chirped. This bunch of fools was doing so before the months of demons arrived, and continued to do so even now. Did not they know the most important thing in winter was to save their strength? When the time came for them to run for their dear life, they would probably have to ask gods to give them an extra pair of legs. But thanks to this gang of fools, he was able to estimate the time when he should depart. Yes, he wanted to flee this devilish town. Although the orders of Prince Timothy were for him to keep lurking in border town, so as to observe the movements of Prince Roland Wimbledon and pass the information to Valencia, he did not want to stay any longer. He was afraid that after half a month, he would join the residents here to become the demon's sacrifice. This was not an exaggeration. Since winter arrived, strange things kept happening, which the others might not have been aware of. It was not surprising as most of the town people were country bumpkins. Other than food, they did not care about anything, and they did not even care about the deities. But he was different. He was Groundhog Cole. Inquiring about the news and stealing intelligence was his special skill, so that was why His Highness Timothy hired him for such a job. As for the city wall that came out of nowhere overnight, or the iron stick that made loud strange noises but could also defeat demonic beasts, of course, this was not the most amazing discovery he found. Prince Roland was openly keeping witches. Merciful God, was there anything more exaggerated than this? The prince had to be controlled by demons, otherwise, he could not think of any other explanation. Even if the prince wanted to dally with the witches, he could lock them in the castle and have fun anytime. This was not the first time that Cole heard about the nobles secretly hiding witches, those wanton sorceresses who nobody would care about if they died suited the strange tastes of some nobles. However, openly admitting it was another thing. This was not his delusion, for he actually saw it with his own eyes. Following the principle of you worked for whoever gave you money, if the snow was not too heavy, Cole would stroll around the city wall, where he could often see the figure of Prince Roland. Originally he was surprised, what made this incompetent prince have the courage to stay in border town, rather than rush back like a scaredy cat to Longsong's stronghold. But now he fully understood. Roland Wimbledon had long been possessed by the demon. He saw with his own eyes that the city wall was penetrated by huge demonic beasts. The demon used thunder to attack it, then the demonic beasts that flocked forward was engulfed by the hell flame summoned by a witch. Finally, this witch also fell into the prince's arms, yet the entire militia did not seem surprised. He then heard the rumors of the neighborhood, saying that there was a witch with healing power. She cured someone's injured son and also cured some old lady who broke her leg. What blasphemous words! How could they accept the treatment of a witch? How is that different from accepting the demon's corrosion? What made Cole determined to return was the incident that happened 2 days ago. He saw a witch fly out of the prince's castle, flying around the castle twice and flying back. The priest of the church often said that after the witch was tempted by the demon, she could get only one power. He had already seen flame and flight. Coupled with the rumor about the witch that could heal, it meant that this small town actually had 3 witches. There was no doubt that the demon had already turned the Lord's castle into the demon's party nest, and the inhabitants of the land were gradually being controlled by him. Cole had to flee as soon as possible. Anyway, he knew the secret about the rapid construction of the city wall. As long as he passed this information and the stolen alchemy powder from the city wall to Prince Timothy, he would most likely not be punished, but would even be rewarded. The more he thought about it, the more he regretted not evacuating with the nobles and returning to Longsong's stronghold at the start. Now that he wanted to leave, road traffic would not work, as the snow throughout the winter would cover all the roads. His only chance was by the waterway and using the merchant ships of Willow Town. According to Cole's observation, on the first day of each month, ships from Willow Town would bring food over. After 2 to 3 hours of unloading and loading, it would sail away from the pier. He had to use this time to infiltrate the boat, or he would have to wait till the next month. Today was exactly the first day of the month. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right at this time, Cole heard the familiar slogan. Outside the window, a platoon of young men dressed in brown leather vests was running. If he had not long seen through the demon's plot, he would also be deceived by their youthful vigor. He thought. He put on his fur coat, tightened his belt and walked out of the hut. Neighbors were outside collecting dried fish, and they even greeted him. "You're going out so early?" he had to say. Although the lord of Border Town was controlled by the demon, these fools' lives actually changed for the better indeed. They even dared to dry fish outdoors. If people were famished, even the dried fish that was frozen like stone, they would be able to swallow it whole. Cole did not have time to reply. He looked at the disappearing militia in the west and went straight towards the direction of the pier. Here the inhabitants took him for the brother of Iron Paddle, who came from fallen Dragon Ridge to visit his loved ones. Of course, that was all lies spun by him. Before he got rid of Iron Paddle, he asked for his name and address and pretended to be his brother to lurk in the town. As for his casually fabricated identity, he did not care if those fools believed him or not. The snow on the slated road was swept a few days ago, and now it almost covered the top of the shoes. He kept a firm pace as much as possible to conserve energy. He did not worry about leaving his footprints, for it would take just one day that the snow would cover them again. Maybe after he reached Valencia, they would still be kept in the dark. When he was approaching the pier, Cole saw the long-awaited sailing ship of Willow Town. Bags of wheat were being moved out while cabin guards watched the area. He touched his pocket, and inside there were 2 gold royals and 6 silver royals, which was his entire belongings. There were 6 guards, who would not bother about the silver royals, and yet he did not have enough gold royals to share. So he had to target the porters. The stacked goods provided a blind spot. Besides, he was good at knocking out and replacing a porter. If he could smuggle onto the boat, he believed that with the temptation of the gold royals, the captain would very likely be persuaded to harbor him and take him away. Just as Cole was ready to act, uproar came behind him. His heart secretly assumed the worst. When he turned back, he saw a few members of the militia team coming toward him while people around were moving towards him. Apparently, he had been surrounded. Seeing that the attempt to escape was hopeless, Cole immediately held up his hands and knelt on the ground. In his line of work, it was important to not stubbornly resist. As long as he spilled the beans about his employer, he would generally be safe and sound, or they would even pay a higher price to hire him instead. Do as much work as you're paid for was also Groundhog Cole's principle. But he did not understand how he was exposed. Chapter 71, The Spy Part 2. In addition to the flame in the fireplace, there was also a mahogany candle holder on Barof's table. The top was divided into 4 forked branches, with the one in the middle being the highest and the other 3 in a triangular shape. Each branch had a burning candle on it, with their quiet light like bright icy mountain tops. The room was filled with the smell of pine oil. The scent of sweet and moist rotten wood made him sleepy. But in Border Town, he could not ask for more. Elegance had nothing to do with this poor land, and having a house for shelter was already very good, not to mention that he now had a large group of houses. His office was located in a compound not far from the castle, where the city hall initially built by the former Lord lay. Of course, the Lord took all his men when he left, and now it was the assistant minister's territory. The continuous rustling sound of writing and the whistling winds outside the window constituted 2 different worlds. Barof was struggling to write on a wooden table fully covered with books and old scrolls. There were 2 low-lying long tables beside him, which were hardly used and just for placing manuscripts. When it was necessary, he would call his disciples to work at the low table to arrange information or compose drafts. The candle on the mahogany holder had already been changed 3 times. Apart from getting up to replace them, Barof did not stop writing. Time was precious for him. There was a pile of documents waiting for him to deal with, and His Highness' financial expenditure also needed to be carefully reviewed. Now Barof worked an average of 10 hours a day, but he did not feel tired at all. Instead, here he was able to work freely and had unending vigor. He thought. He no longer had to ape his tutor's footsteps. All the disciples had to obey him. No one dared to hinder him or cause problems. As long as he completed the orders of His Royal Highness, the specific process of governance could be decided by him. It would be perfect if the prince's order could be slightly more normal. Barov pouted regretfully. For example, the document in front of him that had Roland's personal seal had a request to send staff to Willowtown to recruit management personnel and also to purchase a double-mast ship. The second article also specifically wrote, in view of the price, you can do without the captain, helmsman, and sailors. He did not know whether to laugh or cry after reading it. Without these people, who will drive the ship back? Do you expect them to walk back after buying it? Why do you need to buy a boat? This is the most critical point. The trading between Border Town and Willowtown was very stable. If you want to expand the ore trade after winter, you can just ask them to increase the number of boats. Buying boats isn't a wise choice, not to mention the town's port can only be used for docking. Without any shipyard protection or sailors to manage them, it will be abandoned before long. Probably His Highness was up to his crazy ideas again, right? As for the first request, he could understand its motive. Currently, everyone in the city hall was busy. The dozen staff that Barov brought was responsible for the regulation of commerce, statistical reports and income and expenditure settlements. He himself handled the administrative and legislative services, which was obviously unreasonable. If His Highness wanted to separate these departments, he needed to increase the employees in the city hall. This was a very normal reason, but yet Barov did not want to let go of his power so soon. Having all the power in his own hand was just too satisfying. He thought that even his teacher, the kingdom's treasurer, was only responsible for the finances of Greycastle. But he, Barov, was the hand of the king. He added in his heart. Although His Highness Roland had promised this, there was still a long way to go before he could ascend the throne. Barov found that he subconsciously included Prince Roland again as a contender for the throne. In the past, he would not have thought that this noble son with bad character and lack of any learning or skills could be crowned king. Since coming to Border Town, he had no end of surprises. Up till now, Border Town was under the protection of the militia. It was standing firmly in the western region and looked like it would persist for a long time. This was already good enough. Coupled with His Highness' new inventions, and a good understanding of the people's hearts, he was completely different from Prince Roland back in the kingdom of Greycastle. He resembled more a demon who had an insight into everything. At this time, there was a sound of knocking at the door. Barov reluctantly stopped the business at hand, and said, "Come in." Coming through the door was one of his favorite disciples, the writer Yarrow. "Teacher, another rat was caught." "Yeah. Did you manage to find out anything?" He said he was sent by the second prince. "We found a package of cement powder on him, some coins and a letter." Yarrow came forward, handed Barov a leather-wrapped envelope. "We're still interrogating him to get more information. Teacher, how should we deal with him just like before?" "After interrogation, compile all the information into a book. Then sentence him as guilty and hang him," Barov said nonchalantly. "Yes," said Yarrow with a bow, "in that case, I'll take my leave." The door was closed again, but Barov did not go back to his work immediately. Instead, he went back to the table and used an envelope opener to take out the letter. He thought. Way before the months of demons arrived, Roland Wimbledon had called him to discuss this problem. His Royal Highness believed that when the cement, new snow powder, and witches were disclosed, the spies sent by his siblings would not be able to retain their patience and would come out from hiding. This would be the best time to remove the rats. Barov agreed with the first half of the statement, but did not agree with the latter part. In his view, Border Town had more than 2,000 people, so it was impossible to monitor everyone. They did not have the manpower or time to prevent this sort of small offense. His Highness refuted. How could there be no one? Every subject of Border Town can be our eyes. At that time, Barov felt it was wishful thinking on the prince's part. He wanted to let these ignorant and dull civilians monitor the possible emergence of rats? It was completely impossible. It turned out that he was wrong. At the first census conducted in winter, Roland deliberately mentioned to all the indigenous people that stayed here for more than 5 years, Longsong Stronghold's conspiracy to burn the grain failed, but they still did not give up. They already sent enemies to lurk among the people. Most of them were disguised as relatives of the town people or businessmen that did not evacuate in time. These spies would find any opportunity to scourge everyone. If anyone saw any suspicious characters, they should report it to the city hall immediately. Once verified, they would receive a reward of 25 silver royals. This trick turned out to be surprisingly effective. Although there were some false reports, it was not long before that the first rat got caught this way. At that time, Barov also remembered that Roland proudly said something quite awkward. What was it? He tried to think. That's right, let the enemy get drowned in the sea of the civilian battles. Really weird wording and syntax. Barov shook his head and spread out the letter. The guy, known as the Groundhog, repeatedly stressed in the letter that many factors proved that Prince Roland Wimbledon had been replaced by a demon. Barov could even read his fears through the lines. Associating this with His Highness' manipulation of human sentiments, Barov could not help but agree. He took a deep breath, moved the letter to the candle, and soon the paper was engulfed by the flame and turned into ash. Chapter 72, The Palace Discussions in the King's City. Timothy Wimbledon was sitting on a throne, with a red gemstone scepter in his hand, looking down at the ministers in the palace hall. He thought this feeling was what he wanted, instead of staying in Valencia, entangled with businessmen for trivial matters. When he knocked the tip of the pure gold scepter on the polished marble floor, a crisp sound reverberated. He nodded when the attention of the people was on him. Let's begin. Your Majesty, I have something to report. Knight Weimar spoke first. He was nicknamed Steelheart Knight, responsible for the defense of the King's City. Go on. Can we suspend the manhunt of witches? Your Majesty, the hunt is getting out of control. Yesterday, I heard that some girls from civilian families were arrested and interrogated in the dungeon. One of them actually died there. Later, it turned out that they weren't witches. Now people in the outer city are panicking. If this continues, I'm afraid people will be fleeing in droves. Timothy frowned. It was him who had ordered the hunt of witches. King Wimbledon III's true cause of death was still unascertained so far, but he did not think his father would commit suicide. In particular, the strange smile prior to his death gave Timothy the creeps. The church also confirmed that the god's stone of retaliation on his father's wrist was not switched, making it still effective. But these things alone could not completely exonerate the witches. When it came to oddness, no one was better at it than the witches. He shifted his gaze to Langley, the person leading the witch hunt, and namely the minion trained by him. The latter stood up. Your Majesty, it was just an accident. I've severely punished the personnel involved. He counted with his fingers. The warden, the castellan, and the guards have been sentenced to 10 lashings and fined 25 silver royals. 1 person is dead and 3 cruelly tortured. but the villains are getting off with just a few whips and some fines? Knight Weimar said coldly. And who gave you the right to make that sentence? His Excellency Prime Minister Wyke, or Minister of Justice Lord Palaw? Your Majesty. At the unusual time, I have to act unusually. Langley knelt down on his knees, crying out his grievances. Despite some negligible setbacks, the witch hunt has been very successful. We've caught at least 15 witches lurking in the King's City. The witches are being tortured. We'll soon be able to know whether they have anything to do with your father's whether there's a conspiracy. Timothy glared at him. The fool had almost exposed his own intentions. Although the ministers in the hall could guess his real purpose, the word to the public should be that the first Prince Gerald had killed the king. He would not allow this point to be overturned. 15 witches? Steelheart Knight scorned in a contemptuous tone. Very well. Originally the King's City had become the Witches' Battalion. A few years ago, the church captured only 6 members of the Witch Cooperation Association during the rounded-up hunt at the forest east of the King's City. It seemed your minions are stronger than the judgment army of the church. That's enough. Timothy said. He was annoyed with the fool Langley, who had equally foolish subordinates. If he did not lack talents at the start of his throne ascension, he would not have promoted this fool. Even if he had wanted the credit, he should not have faked the numbers. These 15 people were probably the same as those hapless civilian women. He did not want the church to intervene, but there was no other way. Go to the church and ask Priest Ferry to confirm the identity of those 15 people. Stop all the inquisition and torture. Whenever you arrest anyone, a priest's verification is required from now on. If I find out that you've failed to keep your subordinates in line again, I'll throw you into the King's City moat as fish feed. Well, yes, Your Majesty. Do it now. After asking Langley to leave the hall, Timothy turned to his treasurer. If any one of them is wronged, please compensate each with 2 gold royals, including the previous 3 persons. Compensate the family of the one who died in prison. He paused and added, give 1 more gold royal. As you wish. The treasurer nodded. Your Majesty is merciful. Knight Weimar also remarked, saluting. Let's move on to the next item. Breathing out turbid air, Timothy noticed his ministers were silent. Since no one has anything to add, I'll speak. He turned towards to Umbrella, Sir Bullet, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and said, the recall has been issued for more than a month, but no one has returned to the King's City. What's going on? Sir Bullet was from the Flint family and had remained in his position for 3 decades. He was old with a head of gray hair, an age where one of his feet was in the coffin. He cleared his throat. I'd like to report to Your Majesty. I've heard nothing about your 3rd younger sister, Garcia Wimbledon. Your 4th younger brother, Roland Wimbledon, has replied with a letter. His letter said he'll consider returning after the months of demons ended, when his subjects are safe and sound. But what? He addressed you as His Highness on the envelope, not His Majesty or the King. Timothy could not help sneering. His hopeless brother was still as stupid as ever. If Roland would return and serve him as the king, he could give him a good fief, where Roland might enjoy wealth and honor as a prince. If he did not come back, he should prepare his deathbed as soon as possible. No matter what Roland did, he would be prepared. Roland wanted to return, but did not want to bow his head in submission. What was the use of having a silver tongue? Let him do as he likes. Timothy waved. How about my 5th sister? Your Majesty, she's missing. What? What do you mean? She initially agreed to leave with the messenger I sent. But a week later, she's gone missing along with her butler and 2 maids. I've ordered people to look for her. So far there's no information on her whereabouts. Timothy felt like his heart was blocked. Originally, he had had great expectations of this sister, hoping that she would be able to assist him. After all, Tilly had performed extraordinarily smartness from her childhood, even more brilliant than him. Compared to him, she was at a disadvantage to him only in one aspect: she was a girl. At first Timothy had been confident in her. From his father's arrangements, he did not intend to involve Tilly in the succession turmoil. She was to be given the domain in Silver City, near the King's City. The business and trade there were ordinary, without condition to keep soldiers. It was strange that his 5th sister would unexpectedly go missing. Was this the choice of a smart person? Since she's missing, let the former lord take charge of Silver City. Keep looking for her. I can't let royal blood be stranded with ordinary folk. Gritting his teeth, he tried to suppress his upset. Then, is my 3rd sister the only one left to refuse to obey me? Yes, Your Majesty. Since she's so stubborn, then I to take some tough measures. Timothy looked to Prime Minister Marquis Wyke. It required the agreement by both the King and Prime Minister to issue an order on the war. As the Prime Minister was his largest supporter, it should not be a problem. Timothy said, I plan to ask Duke Joey and the Southern Territory to dispatch their troops, force Garcia to give up the port of Clearwater, and escort her back to the King's City. Sure enough, Marquis Wyke replied, the matter shall not be delayed. Your Majesty, please issue your order as soon as possible. The Minister for Diplomacy will be responsible for executing it. Timothy nodded with satisfaction. He was about to call the clerk to draft the document, when they heard the sound of hooves outside the hall. After a burst of noise, a knight in a blue striped cloak pushed the door open and marched inside. Timothy recognized him, named Moore, the famous Frostwind Knight. He went straight to the center of the palace hall, and knelt down on one knee. Your Majesty, I've just received the news from the south. He breathed a sigh of relief. Garcia Wimbledon, your sister, defeated Duke Jocole in the Southern Territory, and occupied Eagle City. And she declared herself as Queen of Clearwater. All the lords have responded in support to her. The Southern Territory's independent. Chapter 73, The Cannon Test. On the bank of the Redwater River, the west of Border Town. The snow made it difficult for the carriage to move a single step. They spent half a day hauling their first field artillery out of town. What's it this time? Asked Carter, who had been accustomed to the new inventions of the prince. A larger flintlock. Kind of, Roland answered, and then commanded his people to remove the hook. He adjusted the angle of the gun carriage in person to keep the cannon flat and put the pole in the snow. The principles of the cannon and flintlock were exactly the same, so it was very appropriate to call it a larger flintlock. The cannon could load 12-pound, solid iron balls, with the shells and gunpowder put into the front chamber and ignited with fuses. Referring to the mature designs in history, Roland instructed the carpenters to build a wooden gun carriage for it. In order to improve the durability, they also wrapped the edges of the parts with iron sheet, which bore more friction with the ground and more forces when launching. To make the carriage and wheels, Roland spent almost the same time as drilling the cannon bore. It took 3 carpenters 1 full week to complete them. Especially to make the wheels, with a diameter of half the height of a man, the carpenters first shaved 4 square timbers of equal length, and then infiltrated them and baked them with fire to bend them. Next, they whittled the groove for joggle jointing at the ends. This entire procedure alone took 4 days. Therefore, in Roland's eyes, this handmade, 12-pound field artillery of a limited quantity was giving off a dazzling light. When the cannon was dragged out for a test, the prince made special arrangements. Besides Chief Knight Carter and Militia Commander Ironaxe, all the guards and knight apprentices also went along. 12 members of the militia were sent to empty the venue and keep alert. In addition, he brought Nightingale and Lightning for the first time. Thanks to Nana, the prejudice towards the witches had reduced significantly, and Nana herself became the person who was second only to the prince in stature. Do it according to the process, and clean the bore first. Although Roland was quite clear about the structure of the cannon, he knew nothing about the operation. He was racking his brain trying to recall the scenes of operating the cannon in various medieval movies, trying to figure out a process. However, only God would know what the actual result would be. Lightning was in high spirits. She pulled out a mop-like cleaning rod from underneath the gun carriage and poked it into the muzzle. Different from the other witches' contracts, Lightning proposed that as long as she was allowed to manipulate all kinds of novelty inventions, she would like to work for Roland with no salary. In the face of this money-saving condition, Roland naturally agreed. Anyway, when it came to a secret project, he would study it secretly. There were many ideas in his mind waiting to be realized, and there would be enough for Lightning to study for a long time if he casually tossed out a few ideas. She fiddled a few times, but the mop did not bring out any debris. However, according to the process, she had to clean it a second time. She took another mop and fiddled a few times again. Then the bore cleaning was done. "Do you see it clearly?" asked Roland, looking at the knights and the militias. The test was also an exercise. Since the production of the flintlock had increased significantly, the militia was bound to evolve into a regular infantry, while wooden spears would be replaced by flintlocks and cannons. This required a lot of shooting training, so they would skillfully operate these two hot weapons on the battlefield. Seeing that everyone nodded, he let Lightning move on to the next step. Lightning took out a package of gunpowder wrapped with paper, and stuffed it straight into the end of the cannon bore with a wooden pole. Then she put a shell into the end. After that, she took out a drill pipe and put it through the fuse hole in the rear of the cannon barrel, stabbed the gunpowder package, and then inserted the fuse. Thus, the launch preparation was complete. To prevent accidents, everyone withdrew 30 steps and hid behind the bunker. After Lightning put the torch close to the fuse, the spark shone immediately and soon drilled into the cannon barrel in a short time. Then there was a loud noise. The high-speed airflow from the muzzle brought up the snow and raised a snow fog above the ground. The 12-pound cannon had a valid range of more than 1,000 meters in theory. Even if there was no rifling, the front shell would go in a straight line. The armor target, placed about 100 meters away, clanged and flew up when it was hit by the 12-pound iron ball. The speed of the iron ball did not reduce and it bounced back immediately when falling on the ground, stirring up more snow. When the smoke of gunpowder cleared, Carter and Ironaxe were the first to run to the target. They found that the front of the armor target completely sunk, and the front deck was attached to the rear deck, with a palm-sized hole in its center. Obviously, the shell continued to fly forward about 100 meters after penetrating the target. Even when it fell on the ground, it kept rolling forward, showing the amazing power it contained. "What a terrible penetrating force!" Carter exclaimed. He could imagine the horrors of the enemies when they gathered together and then became broken down by several shells. By the name of 3 gods, Ironaxe began to believe that Roland was the messenger of the goddess. Except for the messenger of the goddess, Who else could play the power of the flame to such an extent? The gunpowder particle, which he had repeatedly studied, was a common flammable material as long as it was ground up into powder and ignited. The flame was the goddess' surging anger, as well as her most powerful weapon. Thinking of the never-ending, orange fire erupting from the whole of the southernmost land, he had an impulse to worship the prince. Roland was not surprised at the results, for the 12-pound field artillery could be described as a classic cannon. Especially the famous Napoleon cannon, which shone in the American Civil War, fully proved that the large caliber was the beautiful truth. Next, he tested the cannon's strength with different doses of gunpowder. Although he knew that it could cause damage to the cannon, it was necessary to do the tests. When shooting with 3 parcels of gunpowder, the cannon muzzle rose and the carriage moved, but the barrel showed no obvious deformation. It seemed that the steel barrel was excellent in strength. Finally, Roland determined the standard amount of powder should be 1.2 times the amount used in the test. All that was left was to select the cannoneers and practice it over and over again. "Your Highness, this weapon is powerful, but it's too heavy. If it were to run into a pit, it could hardly move," said Carter, who immediately found the shortcomings of the new weapon. Moreover, the cannon barrel should be cleaned every time before loading. "Since the cannons use more gunpowder and shells than the flintlocks, I'm afraid we need 5 or 6 people to operate one cannon." "Yes, but everything is worth it. As long as we're equipped with 2 or 3 cannons, the the demonic beasts, like giant turtles, will be impossible to break through the city wall." Roland coughed and felt that was close. As for the shortcomings of the 12-pound cannon, he intended to solve that by shipping. It would be a complex and huge mechanical system to apply steam engines to steam-powered boats, even to the most primitive paddle steamer. Instead of transforming them by himself, it would be better to buy 2-mast sailing ships, and then quickly transport the militia and the cannons behind the Duke's troops with Wendy's control of the wind. With this, he would attack from both sides and annihilate the Duke's forces. Chapter 74, The Shipbuilding Program. What? What do you mean we can't afford it? Roland sat in the office, looking at the request documents to recruit more administrators and purchase sailing ships. Baroff cleared his throat and answered, "No, Your Highness, we can't. The price of a 2-mast sailing ship is between 80 to 120 gold royals, but that's just the cost of shipbuilding. The price may be higher with crew costs. The total price is estimated at over 200 gold royals. Didn't I say that we don't need sailors or helmsmen? We also don't need a captain. We just need a ship," Roland said, hammering on the table. With Wendy on board, he would not need so many people to operate the sailing ship. Most of the inland river boats sailed straight. It was as easy to operate as raising and lowering a flag. So the oarsmen and sailors were redundant, and any helmsman could handle that. Anyway, with the vector of wind, did he have to worry that the boat would not go forward? "Your Highness, there's no such business, at least not in Willow Town," Baroff explained carefully. "You may not know much about the industry. Generally speaking, the owner of the ship is also the captain, maybe a businessman, or a noble. The former will recruit the crew himself and do business or transport goods between the major towns and docks. The latter will normally recruit a deputy captain to live on the ship instead of himself. Employees aren't paid on a monthly basis, but once every 1 to 3 years. Most of the time, the ship and the crew are tied together. If you purchase the ship from the captain without the crew he hired, then he loses the hiring salary. Even for the great nobles, 80 gold royals isn't a paltry sum that can be freely shed. Including the rough gemstone trading with Willowtown from the beginning of this month, City Hall now has a total of 315 gold royals. If you spend most of it purchasing the ship, you won't be able to pay the militia next month. The assistant minister said this without pausing, and then lifted his cup to drink his ale. You said most of the time, yes. He nodded. There are two cases when the ships will be sold without the crew. The first case is that the merchant is in desperate need of money so that he'll sell his property. He'll also dismiss all the crew and then sell the ship as soon as possible. The other case is that the owner wants to buy a new ship. It's easy to understand. But I have to say that both cases are very rare. Wait. Roland frowned. You said to buy a new ship. Where do these ships come from? Port of Clearwater, Ch51-75, and Farsight Point. Only seaports have shipyards and can produce new ships. So, this was what he had meant when he said there was no such business, at least not in Willowtown. Roland was silent for a moment. It was too far away to go to seaports to buy ships. And if he did not hire a crew, who would help him to get the ships back? In that case, Ale will think it over. When the assistant minister left, the prince was lost in thought. Shipping was an irreplaceable part of his strategic plan. Without fast and convenient shipping, he would not be able to use cannons in the battle. The Duke of Longsong's stronghold usually recruited farmers, knights and mercenaries, and the marching speed would be slow. However, their speed was slower. As Carter had said, by land, a mud pit could make the cannons difficult to move, even one step. There were no asphalt roads in this era, not even any stone roads. There were so many people walking that they formed trails. The road was fine during sunny weather, but it got muddy on rainy days. Would he have to build the ship himself? Roland spread out a piece of paper and wrote down the specifications he needed. Firstly, the ship would need to transport 1 or 2 cannons as well as about 30 people. Ships in this era were driven by sails and not equipped with a power system. Secondly, the ship would only be sailing on inland rivers. It would need to be stable and reliable. With a shallow draft, it would not be easy for it to capsize or sink. Thirdly, it would need to be easy to operate so that the militia could handle it quickly after minimal training. Considering all these points, there was only one solution: a barge. In the world where Roland used to live, this kind of ship, with its extremely shallow draft and low center of gravity, could be seen everywhere along almost all the river routes. In the old days, the ships stacked with sand or gravel, almost flat with the surface of the water, were all barges. As long as there was a tugboat, it could pull several barges forward like a train. After the ship type was determined, the next key point was to determine which material should be used to build the ship. Roland wrote down 3 options: wood, iron, and concrete. Men first made ships with wood. From rafts to the ship of the line, from sailing in the rivers to sailing in the seas, wooden ships could always be a good choice. It was a pity that Roland did not know how to make a flat boat with logs, and there were no craftsmen. If he relied on the few carpenters, he could only make a large raft which could fall apart at any moment. Iron ships were built similarly to houses. The keel was made up of the primary and secondary beams put in a crisscross and covered with iron sheets. If Anna could do the welding, then the overall stiffness would be guaranteed. However, it would deplete the reserves of the iron ore, which were already small. It was clearly a better choice to use these iron ores to produce steam engines and barrels. The concrete boat became the final option. The construction of the city wall had been finished, and there were still some raw materials left. As long as Anna calcinated them once or twice, they would have enough concrete. The construction of the concrete boat was much easier than that of the iron boat. They only needed to make a wooden template reinforced with iron bars, and then fill it with the concrete. Even in his rural village, people could build several concrete boats for fishing. The iron boat would need regular rust cleaning and painting, while the concrete boat would not require much maintenance. It could be built at a low cost, but still be strong and durable. Even if he had not learned how to build an ocean ship, building an inland concrete barge with a relatively low level of technology would not be too hard, would it? Roland picked up a quill and quickly drew the draft of the barge. A shed with walls was put up along Redwater River. In order to facilitate the launching of the ship, Roland located the shipbuilding site as close as possible to the river bank. Sheds could keep out the wind and snow. At the same time, 2 pots of charcoal were put in the room to avoid the impact that low temperature had on the hardening effect of the concrete. The carpenters created the basic template of the hull. The round bow would reduce the forward resistance, and the square stern would increase the loading area. The width of the boat was about 8 meters, and its aspect ratio was 3:1. Compared with the conventional ships, whose ratio was 8:1, it was quite bulky. In the center, they set up 2 masts. The masts were inserted into the bottom of the ship and connected to the iron beams passing through the centerline of the ship. At the stern, they set up a stake reserved for the rudder. Other places were crisscrossed with iron bars. It did not matter that there were no iron wires for banding. All the intersections of the iron bars were personally welded firmly by Anna, forming an iron net over the bottom of the ship. Once the template and rebar were ready, Roland ordered the workers to start the pouring operation. The well-mixed concrete was poured into a template. The middle of the template was flat, and the walls were 1.5 meters high, forming the cabin walls. At first sight, it looked like a very large bathtub. Everyone involved in the construction, including Anna, had never thought that this strange thing made out of the same material as the city wall would eventually be a ship. Chapter 75, The Holy Mountain Part 1. Kara noticed that the witch who was carrying her was breathing rapidly. "Get someone else to carry me," said Kara loudly. "Leaf, you carry me instead." Walking in the cold of the impassable mountain range was very exhausting, especially in the snowy winter. Every day, the 42 witches had to find a suitable camp after walking a short distance and re-energize their medallions to withstand the sudden drop in temperature at night. "Yes, respected mentor." A witch squatted down in front of Kara. Kara summoned the demonic snake and made it wrap around the witch's arms and pull herself up. Kara observed that the witch could not help trembling slightly. "Damn Nightingale," Kara thought bitterly. If Nightingale had not repeatedly refused her kindness, she would not have been cruel to her sister. At this crucial time in their search for Holy Mountain, Kara could not afford to take any risks. And what was the result? After the damned traitor escaped, she was ready to stab her to death without hesitation. This was the result of her kindness. Kara's thoughts were filled with anger. Nightingale had damaged her spine. Although Leaf quickly healed her wounds with herbs, Kara's lower body was already paralyzed, and her feet had completely lost consciousness. "Wait until I reach the Holy Mountain. I will call up more witches and cut you into pieces one day," Kara thought. "Respected mentor, there are demonic beasts ahead of us." Scarlet, who was in charge of investigating, reported. She could see through obstacles, shelters, and all traps. Nothing could be hidden from her. At the same time, She even had the ability to see fast-moving objects clearly. She had been able to knock off the Judgment Army's bolts once, during a confrontation with the church. "Put me down. Leave, you go to help them." The witch nodded as she squatted and placed her on a stone. Her hands supported her body as she fell into the snow. She felt the cold come through her palm. Kara thought unpleasantly, "Couldn't you at least wipe the snow away before letting me down?" But she did not say it. Leaf wasn't a replaceable member of the association. If it was because of Wendy and her good temperament that the witches had gathered and established the Witch Cooperation Association, then it was because of Leaf that everyone had the courage to follow her. Without her ability, most witches would have died along the way, hunted by the church. Thinking of Wendy, Kara could not help feeling hurt. She had never expected that Wendy, who had established the Witch Cooperation Association with her, could betray her for Nightingale. Even when Wendy blew her away, she had not wanted to kill Wendy. The venom secreted by the snake of magic suffering would be painful and take effect slowly, but not lead to death immediately. The toxin could only be removed quickly if nothingness bit her. She just wanted to give Wendy a lesson. If left alone, the toxin would invade her head and could not be cured. It was the wrong decision for Nightingale to take her away. Without the antidote to nothingness, Wendy would not survive for more than a day. Could it be that she, as a church nun, had no chance to go to the end with her sisters? As for the other betrayer, Lightning, Kara did not care too much. She had joined the Witch Cooperation Association recently, and her abilities seemed to be flying. She always put forward different views in the search for Holy Mountain and even openly questioned the Holy Book. If it had not been for the ideals of the Witch Cooperation Association, she would have killed the talkative little girl and tossed her aside in the snow. Two wolf-shaped demonic beasts emerged from behind the hillside. The sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association were skilled at dealing with them. The sisters who were not able to fight moved backward. Leaf drove her magic first, causing weeds to grow rapidly. The green leaves suddenly broke through the snow and entangled the demonic beast's feet. Another witch, Windseeker, dried up the air around the demonic beasts. The two monsters suffocated quickly. Foaming at the mouth, they fell to the ground in convulsions. This was the power of the witches, Kara thought. Common people who relied on swords alone would easily lose their lives in the face of two demonic wolves. Only the witches with magical powers were the darling of the deities. If there was no god's stone of retaliation, it should be called the Hell Stone. How dare the church ride on their heads? She spat on the ground. "Respected mentor, please come up." Leaf came back to Kara and bent down. "Get someone else." Kara sighed. "You're tired." They continued on the road. By noon, the snow was falling less. Stone, who was responsible for the camp layout, found a leeward place. They decided to take a break here and eat something to renew their strength. Stone quickly transformed the land. The snow transformed into fresh soil. The ground seemed to come alive, weaved and wriggled, and soon became smooth and dry. All the witches performed their duties and soon set up the pot to make porridge. The snow was boiled in a cup, mixed with some herbs strengthened by Leaf, and immediately sent out strong fragrance. "Give your badges to Shino," cried the little girl with extraordinary red hair like a leaping fire. Her ability was also related to fire. She could inject temperature into an object and make it glow for a long time. The badges of the Witch Cooperation Association, the coin of Holy Mountain, were made by her alone. The ability seemed insignificant, but it was helpful to the Witch Cooperation Association, especially in the march through the impassable mountain range. If there was nothing to hold heat, it would be easy to lose temperature and fall into a coma in the cold wind and heavy snow. After eating the oatmeal, the witches packed up and continued on their way. According to Kara's conjecture, the so-called gates of hell was actually the key to Holy Mountain. The church deliberately called it the land of evil, hoping to prevent witches from reaching Holy Mountain. According to the records in ancient books, they needed to go through 3 stone gates, and the last one was in the barbarian region. The stone gates were usually hidden under the ground, and would only rise to the surface when the bloody moon appeared in the sky. They had set out from the camp and been walking in the impassable mountain range for about half a month. Soon they would leave the range and enter wild places. Recently, the demonic beasts had been appearing more frequently. "Quick! Quick! Look! What's that?" Suddenly someone shouted in horror. Kara raised her head and was dumbfounded. There was a city in the sky. It was still snowing in the dusky sky, and the clouds were low. The silhouette of a city loomed through the clouds. She had never seen buildings like this before. They looked like spires standing side by side. If the black dots above were the windows, then these spires were about 333 meters high. This was definitely not something human beings could create. Even the church's proudest cathedral, the Hermes Cathedral, was only 50 meters high. Since it was not built by humans, then there was only one answer: the city was built by the deities. Kara was so excited, a voice pounding in her heart relentlessly. She had found Holy Mountain.